Chapter 508. The Devil Troop. Although he had a hunch in his heart, Li Tianlan still felt a little cold when he heard Qin Weibai's words. The Devil Troop was the most mysterious force of the Wang family of Beihai. It was also the trump card that Wang Tianzong could still play in Reki City even though he was imprisoned tonight. But Li Tianlan had never known what the Devil Troop was. So in his uneasiness and anxiety, the sudden appearance of the Devil Troop gave him an absolute surprise, and then disappeared in an instant. The way the other party perished together was extremely tragic. But Cass Rotter's death also completely determined Li Tianlan's defeat tonight. This surprise was absolutely important to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. The Devil Troop. Who the hell are they? They are a group of monsters that are neither alive nor dead, Qin Weibai said softly. Their state is very special, and their bodies are even more special, so they can control murderous weapons. Li Tianlan vaguely understood. He looked at Qin Weibai and asked, "Can they control murderous weapons?" The death of Cass Rotter has proved this. Qin Weibai said, "At the moment when the holy punishment of void was fired, it was not Cass Rotter who was really controlled, but the holy punishment of void. To be more precise, it was the murderous weapons that rebelled, which eventually caused Cass Rotter's death. The holy punishment of void was controlled. The murderous weapons rebelled." Li Tianlan looked at Qin Weibai as if he were listening to a fantasy story. Murderous weapons can also rebel? Dongqing Rushi came over and asked curiously. The murderous weapons themselves are a kind of living metal. They have their own intelligence, so they are extremely powerful. However, we can't understand this kind of life form for the time being, so we can only make use of their power. Qin Weibai said, "Anything with intelligence and life can betray us." "But it's not easy," Li Tianlan suddenly said. Qin Weibai nodded. "But for the Wang family of Beihai, it's not necessarily difficult. Tianlan, you should have heard that the 13 murderous weapons come from the same piece of life metal. And this piece of life metal was obtained by the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai after he defeated a strong opponent." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Qin Weibai's voice was a little cold. "Murderous weapons have lives. It's not easy to make murderous weapons rebel. But since they have lives, they naturally have thoughts. What if the holy punishment of the void thought that the people of the Devil Troop were their own kind at that moment?" Li Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked at Qin Weibai, his eyes burning. Qin Weibai's tone was calm, as if she was talking about the simplest fact. The murderous weapon can make the murderous weapon think that the other person is its own kind. Naturally, there are a few fragments of the murderous weapon in the body of every person in the Devil Troop. "You mean," Li Tianlan's voice suddenly became unprecedentedly dry. "Every member of the Devil Troop is a murderous weapon?" In essence, every member of the Devil Troop was once an invincible realm expert of the Wang family of Beihai. Their bodies will age and their realms will decline, but in order to protect the Wang family of Beihai, they willingly accepted the transformation of the Wang family of Beihai. This transformation is very complicated, and the most important thing is the implantation of the murderous weapon fragments. The implantation of the murderous weapon fragments will integrate the spirituality of the fragments with their physical skills, so that their bodies will always be alive. After that, the Wang family of Beihai should take measures similar to freezing and completely seal these people. They will die. Dongqing Rushi suddenly said seriously. Qin Weibai glanced at her and nodded. The Wang family of Beihai has the immortality potion. The reason why the production of the immortality potion is rare is that several of the medicines are hard to find in the world. But the rarest materials are not for making the immortality potion. Do you understand? For example, to make a pure immortality potion, it needs about 60 kinds of precious materials, but to make a finished immortality potion, it needs 80 kinds of materials. The latter 20 kinds of materials are added to neutralize some of the side effects of the immortality potion. Without these 20 kinds of materials, it is also the immortality potion with the same massive vitality, or even more powerful, but it is also a kind of poison that can make people doomed eternally. After adding the latter 20 kinds of medicines, The immortality potion is the most precious immortality potion, because it has no side effects and can be taken by people. But for the devil troop, what they need is the simplest immortality potion, which is vitality. This kind of medicine combined with the frozen environment can keep their bodies alive for a long time. But the poison of the immortality potion will gradually make them lose all their memories. The spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality will combine with each other and turn them into monsters that will only obey orders. They don't feel pain, and they don't even have much thinking. Their only goal is to complete the task. They used to be experts of the invincible realm in the Wang family of Beihai. Even if their martial arts have degenerated over a long time, their bodies will always be close to the peak state under the stimulation of the immortality potion. Under such circumstances, the realm they show may be the fire-flaming realm or the thunder-shocking realm, but it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that their defense, speed, and even strength are all in the invincible realm. This is the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The Wang family of Beihai replaced people's souls with the spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality of the immortality potion, turning the former experts of the invincible realm into war machines that can only fight by instinct. That's why the holy punishment of Void regarded the devil troop as its own kind and betrayed Cass Rotter. Li Tianlan took a deep drag on the cigarette. The thick smoke poured into his lungs, and he suddenly coughed violently. Dongqing Rushi and Qin Weibai's delicate palms fell on Li Tianlan's back almost at the same time. Qin Weibai took a glass of water and handed it to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan drank up the water in the quilt. After a moment of silence, he asked, "How many of such devil troop does the Wang family of Beihai have?" "I don't know the exact number. But it won't be less than 20. The oldest devil troop has even been sleeping for hundreds of years. As far as I know, the Wang family of Beihai once used the devil troop on Mount Dibbing more than 20 years ago. At that time, 12 of them were dispatched. If I'm not mistaken, the ones who came to Eastern Europe this time should also be these 12. Qin Weibai said softly, "The vitality of the immortality potion is the most effective when it is frozen. Otherwise, how can they survive for hundreds of years?" In the eyes of the Wang family of Beihai, the devil troop is the most luxurious consumable. They used it once more than 20 years ago. Even if it was frozen immediately, the damage to their vitality should be very serious. When the devils enter the human world, they won't live for long. This time, Wang Tianzong should want to use them all in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan nodded and took a deep look at the screen. The battlefield on the screen once again became extremely chaotic. However, the situation had been completely reversed from before. Raphael and Situ Zhangyue had already met up. Mellad also approached them. Outside them, 5 invincible realm experts, Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hostile, and Violet, were frantically besieging 3 invincible realm experts. On the ground, the elites of Rothschild finally arrived at the battlefield, followed by the elites of Morton and the Violet family. The streets were in a mess, and the war was everywhere. Li Tianlan stood up and looked at the screen. His eyes gradually became sharp. "There's still a chance." Qin Weibai said softly, "As long as Arcis and Charlemagne arrive at the battlefield, there is still hope to turn the situation around." "I won't wait any longer." Li Tianlan suddenly said, "If we wait any longer, they won't be able to hold on." Charlemagne and Arcis hadn't arrived yet. But they would definitely arrive. The situation tonight had been delayed by Paul until now. Paul would definitely know better than anyone that it would be equally disadvantageous for them to delay. Therefore, although Paul had just consumed a lot of physical strength, his attack at this time was still extremely fierce. Situ Zhangyue couldn't hold on any longer. Raphael couldn't hold on either. "I'll go," Li Tianlan said, as if he was talking to himself. He nodded and repeated, "Well, I'll go." Dongqing Rushi opened her mouth subconsciously. She glanced at Qin Weibai and fell silent again. Li Tianlan would definitely join this battlefield. But compared to the plan, it was much earlier and the risk was much higher. "You should do what you want to do." Qin Weibai walked up to Li Tianlan, reached out to touch his face, and said softly, Don't worry, you will win, as long as you are willing to do your best. Of course. Li Tianlan laughed. He directly turned off the screen in front of him. There was no point in watching it. If he couldn't make a comeback tonight, the advantage of Reki City would disappear, everything they had in Eastern Europe would not exist, and the future of the Li family would not exist either. So he couldn't afford to lose. He had to win. Li Tianlan held Qin Weibai's hand that was stroking his face, feeling the gentleness and fragrance. He took a deep breath, looked at Dongqing Rushi again, and said calmly, "Wait for me to come back." He turned around and walked to the door. At the same time, he put on the communication device in the Snowdance core and said blandly, "Gather." In an instant, the entire office of the president was in motion. The room became extremely quiet. Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai quietly. Qin Weibai was also looking at Dongqing Rushi. After a long time, she seemed to have confirmed something, and her eyes became softer. "Sister, should we wait for him to come back?" Dongqing Rushi suddenly asked. "You have to wait." Qin Weibai whispered, "I won't wait." Dongqing Rushi asked subconsciously. "I'm going to Zhongzhou State," Qin Weibai said. Qin Weibai said, "I just said that I will give Tianlan a real magic weapon, one that can match his future sword intent." "Is there really such a sword?" Dongqing Rushi was a little doubtful. There were too many famous swords in the world with unparalleled sharpness, but they were dead objects after all. In Kendo, the sword energy was either sharp or ethereal, and it moved according to one's heart. Therefore, after the Invincible Realm, every Invincible Realm expert in Kendo wanted to find a famous sword that could perfectly carry his sword intent. Silence in Dongqing Rushi's hand was one. Sharpness of the Qin clan in Eastern Europe was also one. As for the peak of the Invincible Realm in the Dark World, almost no famous sword could carry their sword intent perfectly. When they reached the peak of the Invincible Realm, they needed swords with intelligence. That was murderous weapons. Falling stars in Li Tianlan's hand could almost be regarded as the ultimate sword. In terms of sharpness, falling stars might not be sharper than famous swords like Listen to the Sea, Sharpness, and Silence. It might even be a little worse. But in terms of intelligence, Falling Stars was far better than other famous swords. But Li Tianlan's sword intent was also extremely strong. Qin Weibai said that there was a divine weapon worthy of Li Tianlan's future. Li Tianlan was destined to surpass the peak of the Invincible Realm in the future and become the Chosen One. What kind of sword could perfectly carry the sword intent of the Chosen One? Dongqing Rushi couldn't imagine the sharpness of that sword at all. "Yes," Qin Weibai said softly, "in Zhongzhou State, in Lin." Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai and was silent for a while. Then, she was a little hesitant, and there was undisguised worry in her clear eyes. "What should we do here tonight?" Qin Weibai looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. Then she chuckled and said, "Tonight, very good." "What's good about it?" Dongqing Rushi thought about the situation shown on the screen just now and asked without relaxing. The current situation was extremely obvious. There were only Situ Tsangyue and Raphael on their side. Paul, on the other hand, was infinitely close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. Even if Arcis could really arrive in time, Charlemagne of the Heroes Club would also take action, and their side would no longer have an overwhelming advantage. At best, it could only be said that there was a chance. Dongqing Rushi's heart moved slightly, and she asked carefully and softly, "Sister, do you have any other arrangements for Reki City tonight?" Qin Weibai smiled and said, "Everything tonight is Tianlan's plan. His plan conflicts with mine, so I changed my mind." "But Tianlan's plan is not perfect." Dongqing Rushi was silent for a while, and then said softly, "There are indeed loopholes in his plan, but in terms of the general trend, it is already perfect. Don't worry about some flaws." Qin Weibai's eyes were a little dazed, as if she had seen Li Tianlan's situation. He stood in a desperate situation where he thought there was no way out, but he didn't know that there was a greater force behind him. Qin Weibai thought quietly, and her eyes were calm. She was the greatest perfection in Li Tianlan's life. But tonight, Li Tianlan's perfection was not her. That night was the trial day. But tonight had greatly deviated from the original plan. The trial was still going on. But it was no longer the trial day that belonged to her. Qin Weibai came to her senses, smiled, and said, "I'm leaving." Dongqing Rushi wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Qin Weibai walked over, tidied Dongqing Rushi's hair, and said softly, "Don't let your imagination run wild. Tianlan will be fine. You, me, Yuetong, and Tianlan, we are destined to be together." Dongqing Rushi blushed, bit her lip, and didn't speak. Qin Weibai took a deep look at her, turned around, and left. "Sister." Dongqing Rushi's voice suddenly sounded. Qin Weibai stopped where she was and didn't look back. "You came today." Dongqing Rushi suddenly felt a little confused. "Did you just pass by?" If Samsara Palace really didn't have any arrangement for everything tonight, then why did Qin Weibai appear here? Qin Weibai smiled and said, "I came to see Wang Tianzong." Wang Tianzong was still drinking tea and he was not sleepy at all. The water in the teapot had been changed twice, but the fragrance was still there. He held the cup and sipped, and his mind seemed to be completely immersed in his own world. Wang Tianzong was very focused in this state. It was like meditation. When Qin Weibai walked into the room, Wang Tianzong was holding the teapot and pouring water. His silhouette was reflected in her line of sight, looking incomparably lofty and lonely. "The tea is good," Qin Weibai said. Wang Tianzong said yes and said, "Have a taste." Qin Weibai came over and sat opposite Wang Tianzong. The tea was the tea that Li Tianlan had drunk. Wang Tianzong added a small amount of special potion in it. However, this kind of potion that could distract people had no effect on her. In the spiritual field, Qin Weibai was not yet in the transcendent realm. But she was definitely the person closest to the transcendent realm. "Why you here?" Wang Tianzong asked. His emotions didn't fluctuate, only calmness. If Qin Weibai didn't come tonight or came a little later, maybe a lot of things would have happened now. Maybe Li Tianlan would have cooperated with him now. Maybe the pattern of Zhongzhou State and the Dark World for the next 100 years would be determined tonight. There were many maybes. Wang Tianzong felt a little regretful, but he was not angry. "You're hurting him," Wang Tianzong said softly, and his tone was a little emotional. He really felt that it was a pity. Until now, he thought that it was the best choice for Li Tianlan to enter the Wang family of Beihai and Wang Yuetong to be the patriarch. Qin Weibai seemed a little confused. She looked at Wang Tianzong and suddenly asked, "Your Majesty, do you really think it's a good thing for Tianlan to join the Wang family of Beihai?" Wang Tianzong was a little silent. After a while, he said slowly, "At least for me and him, this is the best situation." Qin Weibai smiled. Her smile was a little cold, but it was still perfect and exquisite, with a kind of charm that could topple a country. "It's the best for you," she said softly. "It's not too bad for Tianlan personally. But now he is more than just him. Some things should have been abandoned long ago." Wang Tianzong looked cold and waved his hand. Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to dwell on this topic. She drank a cup of tea and said softly, "He's the best when I'm with him." When she said this, she didn't show off or be arrogant, only endless softness. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. "I came here today just to see His Majesty." Qin Weibai shook her head and answered Wang Tianzong's original question. "I don't know if I should be surprised or disappointed with His Majesty's current state." Her eyes were bright and calm, and her gaze was extremely sharp. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. His eyes were a little dignified, but at this time, there was a little more smile. The Wang family of Beihai has never let anyone down. Wang Tianzong said with a smile, "The sword of Beihai is the same. The sword of Beihai is really sharp and unparalleled." Qin Weibai replied meaningfully. Wang Tianzong's pupils shrank slightly. For a long time, he didn't speak. "I heard that the Wang family of Beihai is forging swords? His Majesty should be preparing for his own breakthrough and wants a divine weapon that can carry your sword intent, right?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. Wang Tianzong's eyes narrowed tightly, and a trace of gloom flashed in the depths of his eyes. The Wang family of Beihai forged swords. The coldness of 9 states. This matter was the top secret of the top secrets in the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Tianzong knew it. Summer Solstice knew it. In addition, only a few sword-forging staff knew it. No one would tell this news. The question was, how did Qin Weibai know it? How is the progress of the divine weapon? Qin Weibai's tone was straightforward and calm. How is His Majesty's current state? Wang Tianzong seemed to have completely calmed down and said indifferently, not far away. Qin Weibai nodded and said, I also have a sword. I want to see the peerless divine weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. Now it seems that it is not the right time. Don't worry. Wang Tianzong laughed. You know the coldness of 9 states, but you are still so confident. So, I also want to see how your so-called divine weapon is. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, you will see me and the coldness of 9 states. The coldness of 9 states, Qin Weibai said to herself in a somewhat complicated tone. She slowly put down the teacup and said calmly, in this case, I will wait for the Wang family of Beihai to shine the brightest in hundreds of years. She stood up. After a few words, she had already planned to leave. Wang Tianzong looked at her back with some surprise. So soon? Qin Weibai's figure paused. She turned to look at Wang Tianzong and said calmly, as I said, I came here tonight to see you. As long as you can't break through tonight, I can temporarily leave Eastern Europe with peace of mind. At present, it seems that you have no possibility of breaking through tonight, so you can't get involved in what happens outside the Caesar Hotel. Oh, Wang Tianzong said. He looked up at his watch. Now, he looked at Qin Weibai seriously. I don't think the battle in front of the Caesar Hotel is optimistic, right? Rothschild may be passive at first, but now, how many of your allies have died? Mitchell, Chaos, Rotter. Qin Weibai told the truth. Tribulation and Qin Shilai have withdrawn from the battlefield. 5 people are missing. Wang Tianzong nodded. When will Samsara Palace take action? Of course, when you break through. Qin Weibai answered without hesitation. So, the master of Samsara Palace is really not dead? Wang Tianzong thought of some rumors, narrowed his eyes, and hid all his emotions. Qin Weibai did not speak. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. It doesn't matter. Wang Tianzong was silent for a while and said blandly, after tonight, the general trend will be changed. Tianlan is destined to ruin his advantage in Reki City tonight. I'm here now, but I won't wait until dawn. I will become the master here. The master here? Qin Weibai couldn't help laughing. Your Majesty, do you think Tianlan will lose? The situation is already obvious. Wang Tianzong asked, how can he win? Indeed, the situation is already obvious. Qin Weibai nodded. But I have a question. You know Rothschild's allies, their lineup and Paul's strength. Naturally, you have also expected the scene in front of the Caesar Hotel. In this case, why did you show your bottom line to Tianlan before? Why did you want to protect Paul and King Tong? The muscles at the corners of Wang Tianzong's eyes twitched, and he suddenly fell silent. Your Majesty, the situation is so obvious. Tell me, how can Tianlan lose? Qin Weibai was aggressive. You know everything that happened tonight. Even the current scene is meaningless. From the moment you were placed under house arrest here, Tianlan had already won. Several allies died, and 2 invincible realm experts withdrew from the battlefield. Even if Raphael and Situ Tsangyue all died here, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, as long as Tianlan was still here, he would not lose. Qin Weibai looked at Wang Tianzong. You know this better than anyone else. As long as you don't make a breakthrough, Tianlan is truly invincible in Reki City tonight. Lose? Do you think it's possible? Wang Tianzong was still silent. His silence was also a tacit agreement. If he didn't make a move tonight, Li Tianlan would be invincible in the world. Very few people know this. But this was the truth. Perhaps Li Tianlan himself didn't know that his current disadvantage was meaningless to Rothschild. As Qin Weibai said, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, even if all the invincible realm experts on his side withdrew from the battlefield, even if all the invincible realm experts standing beside him rebelled, as long as he was still there, he could use the most powerful means to save all this. Wang Tianzong knew this. That was why he showed his bottom line in advance. Tonight, do you want to go to war with the whole dark world? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. In my plan, there should be some time before this night. That is the real trial day. Everyone is guilty. I will use all my strength to judge the whole dark world. Qin Weibai said calmly, but Tianlan started his plan first. I can only take a step back. His plan may not be mature enough, but it doesn't matter. A plan with a 100% success rate doesn't need the so-called maturity and correction. So tonight's trial day is the trial of the Li family. Your Majesty, you are imprisoned here. I should congratulate you for escaping. Although it's only temporary. The meaning of this sentence couldn't be more obvious. If Li Tianlan hadn't planned the war in front of the Caesar Hotel tonight, as time went by, if the real trial day was planned by Qin Weibai, even Wang Tianzong was bound to die. Wang Tianzong shook his head with a smile. You are very confident. It's just a fact. Qin Weibai said blandly, after tonight, the chaos in Eastern Europe can basically end, but I am still looking forward to the final ending. I am looking forward to your Majesty's breakthrough and the sharpness of the coldness of 9 states. Tianlan will make the most complicated situation simple. In the last and simplest situation, I will personally end the glory of the Wang family of Beihai. After the trial, it was not the end. Wang Tianzong would not be willing to end it. When the trial was over, there must be an end. Wang Tianzong stopped talking and turned around again. Qin Weibai continued to move forward. She opened the door and walked out. A slight but pervasive sword intent suddenly rose in the room. The sword intent tore the window lattice in front of Wang Tianzong. The wind and rain poured in, and it was a little cold. Wang Tianzong held the teacup and looked out of the window quietly. Heaven and earth were long. The night rain was boundless. His eyes were deep and cold, and eventually became the most complete silence. Chapter 509. The night in Snow City was even colder than that in Reki City. This was an area shrouded in the polar night. When the polar night fell, it was night 24 hours a day in Snow City. There was no wind or rain in Snow City at night. The lights were bright and it looked extremely quiet. In the northernmost part of Snow City, in the area connected to the mountains, there was a huge manor with a vast area, which was almost equivalent to 2 or 3 blocks. The huge and almost vast manor contained the tranquility of the nearby mountains and rivers and the prosperity of the streets, which was extraordinary. Countless lights were lit up in the manor, almost illuminating the whole manor as if it was daytime. This was Snow City, and it could even be said to be the most prominent place in the vast territory of the northeast of Snow Country. No matter from which angle, this manor, which was so huge that it seemed to be able to swallow the whole Snow City, could bring a very heavy sense of oppression to people. It was a kind of coldness and nobleness that was built up with countless wealth and power. It was an irresistible pressure. There were figures everywhere in the brightly lit manor. Countless heavily armed elites occupied various advantageous formations, almost surrounding the manor like an iron bucket. A very subtle and uneasy aura spread out from the manor, quietly echoing in the whole Snow City. The mountains in the distance were hidden in the night, faintly visible. On a low peak not far from the manor, 2 pairs of eyes were looking down at the incomparably huge and bright manor. The night was dark, and the white clothes were whiter than snow. A man and a woman, both in white robes, looked mysterious and ethereal. The night wind blew through the mountains, and the white robes carried a large amount of sword intent. The sword intent spread out, and the cold sword energy whistled in the mountains with the wind, looking awe-inspiring. Amidst the mournful howling of the wind, a melodious bell suddenly rang out. The man in white took out his mobile phone and glanced at it. The faint light of the mobile phone shone on his face. The man's face was a little pale, but every line on his face was extremely sharp. This was undoubtedly a very attractive man. Even though he was no longer young, he still had a kind of almost flamboyant handsomeness, looking very aggressive. He quietly glanced at the text message on the mobile phone screen and frowned slightly. "We're late." He suddenly spoke in a low voice, but it was extremely pleasant to the ear. A woman in white stood beside him, looking down at the PD in her hands. The image on the computer was constantly rotating at a very fast speed. As the image rotated, it would occasionally flash a corner of the manor in the distance. At this moment, there seemed to be someone hiding in the huge manor in the distance and moving quickly. The woman's eyes were cold and serious. Her appearance was not beautiful, but her clear eyes looked extremely attractive. The wind with sword intent blew her hair. She casually tidied up her hair and said seriously, Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi didn't fight either. The woman's voice paused for a moment before she continued, the other party is fast. The man narrowed his eyes and remained silent. As long as His Highness can hold on, it doesn't matter if it's faster or slower here. The woman continued. The man smiled bitterly and shook his head. I'm afraid that His Highness can't hold on. The current situation, he thought about the contents of the message and looked at the manor in the distance, not saying a word for a long time. The defense of the entire manor was becoming more and more complete. The man's eyes fell on the tall gate of the manor, which was almost as tall as the city gate. The precious alloy gate was shining with a cold metallic brilliance. On the silver door panel, a huge purple flower was carved on it, which looked strange and gorgeous. Violet. Snow City in the northeast of Snow Country in Eastern Europe was the headquarters of the Violet family. At this time, the man and woman standing on the low peak had been lurking in Snow City for half a month, just for this night. The man seemed a little cold and sharp, and his eyes narrowed tightly. The sword energy flew, and his whole person looked more and more fierce. After the restart, the Snowdance Corps had many experts, including Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, Yin and Yang Phantom, and even Fireman, a top expert of the older generation of the half-step invincible realm. The lineup was strong, and there were many experts. But only a small number of people standing at the peak in Zhongzhou State knew that the strongest person in the Snowdance Corps today, apart from Li Tianlan, was not Fireman, the assassin from Sai City, or the swordsman from Mount Shu, but he, who was standing on the low peak at this moment, had never appeared in the Snowdance Corps since the outbreak of the war. Su Chang'e, the sword justice of Jade Pool in Zhongzhou State. He was the junior brother of Dongqing Wudi, the executive minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State, the master of Dongqing Rushi, and the recognized #1 expert in Jade Pool. Su Chang'e held the famous sword of Jade Pool, blowing snow. His sword energy was even stronger than that of the current leader of Jade Pool and First Elder Ling Shuangxue. Su Chang'e entered Jade Pool at the age of 15 and was 46 years old this year. For more than 30 years, he had hardly left Jade Pool. He was the most low-key expert in Jade Pool and had never appeared on any list in Zhongzhou State. This time, he came to Eastern Europe for the sake of his senior brother and disciple. However, to everyone's surprise, although Su Chang'e and Ling Shuangxue came to Eastern Europe, there was no news from them, as if they had disappeared out of thin air. Zhongzhou State had felt uneasy about this and had asked Li Tianlan. But Li Tianlan did not explain. Until now, people in Zhongzhou State and even in the Dark World did not know that the Sword Justice and First Elder of Jade Pool had been lingering near the headquarters of the Violet family. After more than 10 days and several careful investigations, the two finally figured out the internal situation of the Violet family. Tonight, Reki City ushered in the trial day. The Violet family, which dominated Snow Country and could cover the sky with one hand, was bound to be destroyed with the departure of the invincible realm expert Violet. Su Chang'e remained motionless. The long sword named Blowing Snow kept buzzing behind him. The sword energy rose into the sky and kept whistling like a mad dragon. Ling Shuangxue stood beside him and quietly looked at the picture on the handheld computer. Tonight, Eastern Europe was bound to be turned upside down. They were near the Violet Manor at this time. At the same time, other high-level members of the Snowdance group must have arrived around the Morton family. And if everything went well, the two assassins of Sai City should have been flying in all the countries of Eastern Europe at this time. Li Dunlan knew about the cooperation between Morton, Violet, and the Eastern Church with Rothschild. For him, this was the best opportunity. The war broke out in front of the Caesar Hotel. Violet, Lagos, and the three invincible realm experts of the Eastern Church immediately led the elites of their respective families and forces to Reki City. For them, Reki City was their best chance. But with their departure, the headquarters of the Eastern Church, the Violet family, and the Morton family all became empty as never before. Several invincible realm experts might realize this, but no one would care about it. After all the superpowers in the dark world were gathered in Reki City at this time. Who had the time to pay attention to other places? As for Li Tianlan, perhaps they would never have thought that Li Tianlan would be so crazy. When the three invincible realm experts set off for Reki City, Li Tianlan also sent all the experts of the Snowdance Corps and led a small number of elites of the Snowdance Corps directly to their nest. Tonight, Li Tianlan did not leave any strength or leeway for himself. This was a completely hysterical and desperate attempt. If the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps stayed in Reki City, there might be a possibility of saving everything tonight, but it was just a possibility. Li Tianlan did not like possibilities. Victory was victory, and defeat was defeat. Even if Li Tianlan was defeated tonight and died in Reki City, the Eastern Church, the Violet family and the Morton family would also be buried with him. Li Tianlan was not 100% sure whether he would win or not, but he was 100% sure that his opponent would not win. It seemed that since the Li family first appeared in Zhongzhou State hundreds of years ago, there had been an extremely crazy factor flowing in the blood of the Li family. This factor was called paranoia. The picture on the handheld computer finally paused. Ling Xianxia, who had been silent most of the time, suddenly narrowed her eyes. The picture began to freeze. Then, a voice sounded in the ears of Ling Xianxia and Su Chang'e at the same time. In position. Ling Xianxia took a deep breath and turned to look at her senior brother, who was also her husband. Her eyes were clear, and the sword intent was soaring. Tonight, they were carrying out the most difficult task, but they also brought the strongest elites. The intelligence system of the Samsara Palace was pervasive. But they didn't know much about the Violet family, which almost controlled the entire Snow Country. After an intelligence agent in the Samsara Palace, who had been close to the core of the Violet family, was killed in Northern Europe a few years ago, the Samsara Palace had less and less influence on the Violet family. Recently, several experts who had sneaked into the Violet family had not been put in an important position for the time being. Under such circumstances, they could only rely on Su Chang'e and Ling Xianxia to investigate the Violet family by themselves. So as soon as they arrived in Eastern Europe, the two big shots of Jade Pool went straight to Snow City. Without the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, they had to investigate everything about the Violet family by themselves. The support that the Samsara Palace and the Qin clan gave them was also fair. The other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps took the elites of the Snowdance Corps to the Morton family. What they got was the intelligence of the Samsara Palace and the support of the internal personnel. And their actions in the Violet family couldn't be carried out with great fanfare. They had to erase all traces. Because this was Snow Country. And the Violet family was the real ruler of Snow Country. The current president of Snow Country was from the Violet family. Snow Country was not the most powerful country in the world. Their economy was extremely chaotic, but they were one of the most powerful military powers in the world. This country with the largest land area in the world was very poor, but it was overbearing and arrogant. So it could be said to be the most powerful country in the world. And the current president of Snow Country could also be said to be the most powerful and iron-blooded president in the history of Snow Country. The Snowdance Corps wanted to destroy the Violet family, but no one could find the evidence. So the elites who participated in this action tonight were all unfamiliar faces in the dark world. They were extremely strange. They were extremely powerful. A total of 300 people. The super troops of the Lin clan. Xinyuan sword. In position. In position. In position. As the first voice sounded, countless voices responded at the same time. Su Chang'e's eyes had narrowed into slits. The roaring and raging sword energy in the mountains began to condense in an instant. The night, full of cold wind, was completely boiling. It was extremely abrupt, as if it had been prepared for a long time. Su Chang'e finally said, "Kill." His voice was like clear thunder. His voice reverberated in the air. In the next second, a deafening roar resounded throughout the entire Snow City. The interior of the Violet family was instantly ignited with fire. An extreme explosion broke out from the center of the Violet Manor. The waves of fire rose into the sky with black smoke. The violent explosions were continuous and came from almost every corner of the Violet Manor. A large number of elites of the Violet family were swallowed by the fire. Their bodies exploded, and their flesh and blood flew everywhere. In the fire, figures in black appeared one after another. Hundreds of people attacked at the same time and rushed over from all directions. Each of them wore an extremely strange silver mask on their heads. This was the first appearance of Xianyuan's sword in the Dark World in nearly 20 years. There was no cold weapon that symbolized the identity of the super elites. Everyone wore a silver mask and held a silver gun in their hands. It was not a spear. It was a real gun that shone with silver light. The moment they rushed into the manor, every elite of Xianyuan's sword pulled the trigger at the same time. There was no target, no aim. The shape of the silver gun was extremely strange, and the muzzle was thick. As they fired, the thick muzzle spat out balls of light in an instant. The balls of light fell to the ground and dispersed like water. The next second, they directly turned into electric arcs flying everywhere. The moment the electric arcs appeared, all the brilliant lights in the manor went out in an instant. All the instruments stopped working, and the communication signal above the manor completely disappeared. Hundreds of phones fired by guns frantically spread to all corners. A sharp sound that was enough to pierce people's eardrums suddenly sounded with the spread of the electric arcs, filling the entire manor. In an instant, a large number of manor guards suddenly covered their ears and fell to the ground, howling. Blood gushed out of their ears, eyes, noses, and mouths. The sharp sound swept across the manor. Countless people fell down with twisted faces, and some even began to spit out white foam. More than half of the countless guards in the manor fell down at a speed visible to the naked eye. Countless electromagnetic fields were still spreading on the ground, and eventually became the shape of bubbles, constantly bursting. The sound in the manor became sharper and sharper. Pulse hand cannon. Codename Armor Stripper. In the field of individual combat, this was the latest research result of the Lin clan. The powerful feature of pulse weapons was enough to destroy all signals on the battlefield in an instant, destroy human skills, and make people lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Within the coverage of the armor-piercing hand cannon, elites below the fire-flaming realm would completely lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Even those in the fire-flaming realm would have their strength greatly reduced. Only experts in the thunder-shocking realm could really be unaffected. But a large number of experts of the Violet family had gone to Reki City with the Violet family. How many experts in the fire-flaming realm and the thunder-shocking realm could there be in the manor today? The sharp buzzing soon passed. But the number of people who could stand on the ground in the manor had decreased by more than half. In the eyes of the elites of Xianyuan's sword, who wore special masks, everyone who was still standing in the field had become the most conspicuous target. The sudden war was extremely strange. In the silence, the elites of Xianyuan's sword rushed up like a pack of wolves. Fire and lightning bloomed at the same time. In an instant, they pierced through the 3 lines of defense of the Violet family and directly approached the center of the manor. Knowing this, in the luxurious villa in the center of the manor, a furious voice suddenly rang out. The voice was shrill and crazy, like a lion waving its sharp claws in vain after falling into a desperate situation. Who is it? Who dares to attack the Violet family? Damn it, you all deserve to die. Boom. The whole manor seemed to shake. With the lingering sound of anger, all the weapon defense systems in the Violet manor shook at the same time. But the electric arcs of the pulse weapons were still spreading in the manor. After a short shock, the defense system that the Violet family had spent a lot of money to build was less than 1/3 of the weapons that could be put into battle immediately. The battle broke out in an instant. The few elites left in the Violet family kept retreating under the attack of Xianyuan's sword and fled in a panic. The few mists in the manor began to condense light. The next moment, the roar of countless cannons suddenly sounded, and the wild explosion completely shook the night sky. A little white light suddenly lit up in the quiet and deep night sky. The white light suddenly dispersed in the absolute condensation and turned into countless light spots that fell to the ground. Under the night sky, it seemed that a rain of light had suddenly fallen in the silent lights. But as the rain of light fell, countless sharp sword energy rose wildly into the sky in an instant. The white spot in the air gradually became clear. Vaguely, it seemed to be the figure of a woman. She stood high in the sky and danced in the face of the whole sky. She was cold and penetrating, but the sharp and chaotic sword intent was gathering crazily toward her. The sword energy flew and turned into light curtains standing in the air one after another. The dancing trajectory of the white figure became more and more chaotic and erratic. The rain of light was falling all over the sky. The sword energy rising from the ground rushed into the sky. The sword energy tore up the light spots, and there were drifting light spots everywhere between heaven and earth. The figure that kept dancing high in the sky waved her long sword, and the bright blade suddenly stabbed down. The wind blew. The clouds surged. The wind was biting cold, and the night sky was rolling. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The flying rain of light and the rising sword energy stopped at the same time and combined in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the sky and the earth formed a night curtain that almost covered the entire sky. It was gorgeous, beautiful, awe-inspiring, but with an indescribable solemnity. Anyone who practiced martial arts would be able to recognize this move. This was known as the most gorgeous and immortal sword move in the Dark World. People entered the secular world. The sword came out of the world. Jade Pool in Xianxia State. Heavenly flying immortal. At the same time, Eastern Europe. The sharpness of Xianxia State's phantom sword and yin-yang sword exploded in the headquarters of the Morton family. Yun Qinshi, Han Chongyang, Hua Qingfeng, Li Zhonghu, and other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps directly launched a surprise attack on the Morton family as soon as they received a clear signal. Blood flowed like a river, and there were cries everywhere. The entire Snowdance Corps seemed to have become extremely crazy under the leadership of Li Tianlan. The Violet family would not have expected that the Snowdance Corps would launch a surprise attack on them tonight. Neither would the Morton family. Most of the elites of the Snowdance Corps had to stay in the office of the president to imprison Wang Tianzong. In addition, the most powerful part of the Snowdance Corps was thrown to the Morton family by Li Tianlan. Even some high-level members of the Snowdance Corps did not know whether Li Tianlan was really confident or if he was completely crazy. However, the news from Reki City was obviously not optimistic. With the continuous loss of super high-end combat power, Li Tianlan was ready to take action in person. Ordinary elites might not understand what this meant, but every high-level member knew that Li Tianlan's action at this time meant that the situation was completely out of control. This was definitely enough to make people uneasy. On the extremely chaotic battlefield, when Li Wangxing once again pulled Li Zhonghu out of the desperate situation of certain death, the voice of the Lieutenant General of 9 regions, who had always been gentle and somewhat dull, was a little angry for the first time. "Old Li, what the hell are you doing?" Li Zhonghu shook his big head and said in a muffled voice, "Nothing." "Bullshit." Li Wangxing was a little flustered and exasperated. Tonight's surprise attack was perfect. The Morton family had insiders, and their side had absolute strength suppression. The battle should have been easy. But at this time, Li Wangxing had several more wounds on his body. The command of the entire Snowdance Corps had become a little chaotic. It was completely different from when they marched from Im to Ulan State. Li Zhonghu, the commander, was even a little absent-minded. The battle had been dragging on. No wonder Li Wangxing was a little annoyed. "You call this okay? If I hadn't taken action, you would have died at least twice." Li Zhonghu frowned tightly. He suddenly glanced at Li Wangxing and asked, "Aren't you worried about His Highness?" Reki City was their main battlefield tonight. But now the situation in Reki City was out of control. With only 2 invincible realm experts on his side, Li Tianlan had to face King Tong and Paul of Rothschild, Hostile, Violet, and Lagos. No matter how he looked at it, such a move was equivalent to courting death. Li Zonghu did not intend to think about it. But the more he did not want to think about it, the more he could not calm down. If Li Tianlan really died, what was the meaning of their so-called Snowdance Corps' existence? Li Wangxing was stunned for a moment. He took a deep look at Li Zonghu and softened his tone. "Don't worry," he said calmly, "young master will be fine." The corners of Li Zonghu's mouth twitched, as if he were smiling. "Do you mean that His Highness will be fine facing 5 invincible realm experts, one of whom is Paul, who is close to the peak of the invincible realm?" "He'll be fine." The muscles at the corners of Li Wangxing's mouth twitched. He gritted his teeth and said, "Young master will definitely win." "How?" Li Zonghu's voice suddenly rose for a moment, and then he lowered it again. "Why are you so sure?" Li Wangxing shook his head subconsciously, with a trace of confusion in his eyes. "I don't know either." He shook his head, but his voice was still firm. "But young master will definitely win. From the moment Wang Tianzong was imprisoned in the office of the president, we had already won. Because the situation that young master will face next is not important at all." His tone was a little stiff, as if he was comforting Li Zonghu, but also as if he was comforting himself. "Who told you this?" Li Zonghu narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Wangxing, his voice solemn. "It's..." Li Wangxing hesitated for a moment and said with a wry smile, "It's Senior Li." "Do you think Senior Li will hurt his grandson?" Chapter 510. It was the night of August 17th. Reki City was in chaos. The whole of Eastern Europe was in turmoil. In the capital of Snow Country, in the Holy Gorian Church, Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, had been praying for nearly 4 hours. The thick Bible was turning slowly and gently in front of him. The light in the prayer room was dim. The compassionate and holy statue looked extremely majestic. In front of the statue, Patriarch Rock knelt humbly and looked extremely pious. The Holy Gorian Church was not the largest church in Snow Country. It was not even the largest church in the capital of Snow Country. However, Patriarch Rock, one of the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe, was stationed here. In the hearts of all the Eastern Church believers, the Holy Gorian Church could be said to be the most sacred place. Patriarch Rock's prayer and Patriarch Hostile's action began almost at the same time. Patriarch Hostile led the elites of the Eastern Church south into Reki City. Patriarch Rock was praying for the future of all of Eastern Europe. The Holy Gorian Church was heavily guarded. Countless elites of the Eastern Church surrounded the entire church motionlessly. The closer they got to the center of the church where the Patriarch prayed, the fewer people there were, but their strength was getting higher and higher. There were only 2 guards guarding near the prayer room. But they were all famous experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Church was indeed not as strong as the Vatican, which was famous all over the world, but no one dared to say that the Eastern Church was weak. The sphere of influence of the Eastern Church was mainly concentrated in the countries of Eastern Europe, and most of the believers were Eastern Church believers. For many years, even the Vatican had not been able to influence this place. This alone was enough to show the strength of the Eastern Church. There were no experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the Eastern Church, but in terms of foundation and comprehensive strength, at least in Eastern Europe, they could be completely fearless. His Highness Lawrence and our allies have a great advantage. According to the latest news, they have suppressed the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican. The whole process is very smooth. Your Excellency Bolet, congratulations. The 2 guards outside the prayer room stood quietly like sculptures. In the silent atmosphere, the older guard suddenly turned his head to look at his colleague and congratulated him with a smile. Bolet was a little thin. He wore the armor of the Eastern Church, and his entire face was hidden in the helmet, so it was unclear. But as the other party spoke, his eyes suddenly lit up with excitement. That excitement quickly calmed down. Bolet bowed respectfully and said softly, All of this is because of Captain Jiro's care and concern for me. Thank you, I will never forget everything you have done for me. Jiro's laughed with a happy and relaxed expression. He stretched out his hand and patted Bolet on the shoulder, saying softly, "Now you should consider who you want to take to Reki City. Of course, if you don't have a suitable candidate, I can recommend someone for you." Under the helmet, Beauregard lowered his head and said calmly, "Thank you very much, leader." Jiro smiled and narrowed his eyes. The look in his eyes became more and more satisfied. The Eastern Church also had something similar to the Holy Disarmament Corps. In the establishment of the Eastern Church, such a department was called the Knights of Light. There were 4 patriarchs in the Eastern Church. The Honorable Martial Banner of Knights had 4 commanders. Captain Jiro's was the commander of the knights who served Patriarch Rock. He controlled a quarter of the power of the Knights of Light, and Bolet was his most important deputy. Among the 4 patriarchs, Rock and Patriarch Hostile had a very good personal relationship. Before this action, the 2 patriarchs had reached a consensus. In the Battle of Reki City tonight, if the Eastern Church could suppress the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, the Eastern Church would establish a branch of the Knights of Light in Wulan State in an extremely strong manner, which could also be said to be a subordinate agency. For example, the relationship between Knights Templars and the Vatican. The new agency was called the Knights of Light, composed of elites led by Rock and Patriarch Hostile, and a small number of elite warriors of the other 2 patriarchs. Deputy Commander Bolet was the commander of the Knights of Light that both Rock and Patriarch Hostile thought highly of. The geographical location of Wulan State was extremely sensitive and special. If the Knights of Light were established, they would shoulder a very important mission from the moment of its establishment. Reki City was the main road between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the military would fight for it. Tonight, if Patriarch Hostile could expel the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, once the Knights of Light were established, Bolet would become one of the most important figures in the entire Eastern Church. His status was no less than that of the 4 commanders of the Holy Punishment Knights, or even higher, because everyone knew that the Eastern Church's ambition was more than that. The Dark World had been too calm before, and the Vatican had been too strong, so the Eastern Church could only stay dormant in Eastern Europe. But tonight, the Eastern Church and Rothschild had joined forces, and the Violet and Morton families had joined in. As long as they could win tonight, the Qin clan and Rekvia in Eastern Europe would inevitably suffer heavy losses. The Snowdance Corps would also withdraw from Eastern Europe in embarrassment, and the strength of the Vatican would also be greatly damaged. Even if Arcis was lucky enough to survive, there was no need for Paul, who had exposed his strength, to continue to hide. At that time, the Knights of Light would use Wulan State as the foundation, unite Rothschild and the wealthy families of Eastern Europe, and march westward at the same time to take down the Vatican. That was a game that was destined to be magnificent. As long as they thought about it, everyone in the Eastern Church could feel their blood boiling. There was a flash of complacency in Jiro's distant and deep eyes. No matter what the final outcome of this game was, as long as the Knights of Light could be established in Wulan State, he would become the most powerful of the 4 knight commanders. Because Bolet was his man. A cold wind suddenly blew through the deep courtyard of the church. The cold wind blew into the prayer room, and the lights flickered for a moment. In the prayer room, the slight sound of pages turning stopped. The change was very small. Jiro's didn't care. A cell phone suddenly rang. Jiro's glanced down at the screen and answered the call. "What?" The person on the other side of the phone just reported, but Jiro's suddenly exclaimed. His face changed dramatically, and he didn't come to his senses for a while. After a long time, he took a deep breath, suddenly turned around, and strode to the prayer room. "Chief Knight," Bolet shouted subconsciously. "I want to see the Patriarch. I have something very important to report." He pushed open the door of the prayer room. The lights were dim. The Patriarch knelt there, facing the statue. The Bible was open, but the pages were not turning. Jiro's heart was in a mess. But he still suppressed the anger in his heart and slowly said, "Patriarch, I'm sorry to disturb your prayer, but I have something very important to report to you." The Patriarch knelt there, motionless. "Patriarch." Giro's called again. The patriarch's head seemed to have lost its support and slowly drooped. Giro's heart suddenly sank to the bottom. He suddenly took a step forward and rushed directly to the patriarch's side. Everything in his line of sight caused his eyes to become completely lifeless. The patriarch closed his eyes. Blood was slowly flowing out of his chest. The dark red color soaked the red robe, which looked extremely strange. There was a dagger in his heart, a fatal stab. Giros suddenly felt that it was extremely absurd. He couldn't even believe what he saw. Another cool breeze blew in his face. The wind was very soft. But the faint killing intent suddenly became extremely condensed. A subtle, almost invisible lightning was blooming and spreading, light and swift. Giros suddenly came back to his senses and was instantly furious. Countless lightning bolts surged on his body for a moment. Damn it, whoosh! A huge force surged directly from behind Giros before he could make a sound. Behind him, Bolet, whom he had always trusted, suddenly stretched out his hand and firmly controlled his body. This kind of control lasted for a moment. But a moment was enough. A gentle but cold breeze blew into the lightning around his body. A cold but perfect palm appeared in the dim light. The luster of the dagger flashed in his sight. The palm swept past his neck. The blade of the dagger tore Giros's throat in an instant. Warm blood suddenly splashed out and gushed out like a fountain. Giros's eyes widened. Feeling the blood gushing out of the gap in his body, he suddenly understood the cause of the patriarch's death. It was impossible for someone to hide here in advance and kill Patriarch Rock. It was even more impossible for someone to sneak into the heavily guarded church. The only possibility was that the killer was carefully brought in and arranged here. It wouldn't be long. It happened half an hour ago at most. And half an hour ago, he happened to leave once. Giros gritted his teeth and turned his head. Blood spurted out of his neck. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't make a sound. Bolet, who had suppressed him for a moment at the critical moment, was looking at him quietly. There was no pleasure, helplessness, guilt, or complacency in his eyes. His eyes were calm. It could even be said that he was very devout. Bolet seemed to see what Giros wanted to ask. He drew a cross on his chest seriously and said calmly, "Have you heard of the Protestant Church?" Bang. Giros's pupils dilated for a moment. His body fell to the ground and he died with his eyes open. The wind hidden behind the statue blew over and quickly disappeared in the prayer room. The breeze was invisible. It was invisible and silent. It was silent. The duties of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church were extremely clear. Patriarch Hostile, who was ranked on the divine list and could be said to be the top expert in Eastern Europe, was responsible for fighting. Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key and devout, was responsible for consolidating the believers' faith. Patriarch Calendar was the most high-profile. He was also the patriarch that everyone in Eastern Europe was most familiar with. He was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church. Patriarch Marika was the most mysterious and was responsible for preaching. They were the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe. In the list of heresies of the Vatican, the importance of the 4 patriarchs could be said to be second only to Raphael, the leader of the Dark Knights. They were also the 4 most famous heresies in the heart of the Vatican. The strongest Hostile was defined as a killer by the Vatican. He was responsible for all the fighting affairs of the Eastern Church, and he was indeed the patriarch with the most blood on his hands. Rock, who was the most low-key but responsible for the core believers' faith, was defined as a controller. His brainwashing work was extremely successful even in the eyes of the Vatican. Countless fanatics were the biggest obstacle to the Vatican's conquest of Eastern Europe. Calendar, who was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church, was defined as a destroyer. The Vatican had never given up on Eastern Europe, but every time it infiltrated, it was eventually destroyed by Calendar. To some extent, he was a big heretic that the Vatican hoped to get rid of the most. Marika, who was responsible for preaching, was defined as a conspirator by the Vatican. In the field of religion, the preaching of the Eastern Church was equivalent to a war in the eyes of the Vatican. Such preaching was not simply about spreading faith. Specifically, how to weaken the strength of the Vatican. Developing his own believers was Marika's field of work. Tonight, when the battle in Reki City broke out, Patriarch Marika was holding an extremely mysterious meeting in a small city in the south of Wulan State. Marika did not think that Hostile would lose. He firmly believed that Wulan State would become an area controlled by the Eastern Church before the sun rose tomorrow. So in order to set off a religious war in the shortest time, the Patriarch summoned his 6 godsons at once. Without exception, all 6 godsons came from Europe, but not from Eastern Europe. France, England, Italos, the empire where the sun never sets, and Germany. 5 godsons came from these 5 countries, and they were all leaders of a certain wealthy family in their respective countries. And the last godson came from the Vatican. This was Marika's proudest achievement in recent years. After the Eastern Church occupied Reki City, the Morton family, the Violet family, and Rothschild would go all out to cooperate with them and spread the war of faith to the whole of Europe. These 6 godsons from Europe naturally had their own missions, and they were all extraordinary missions. He was a conspirator in the eyes of the Vatican, and he was best at conspiring. The meeting lasted for nearly 3 hours. Marika almost detailed every step of the operation. After confirming that there was no mistake, he ended the meeting. The 6 godsons left one after another. Patriarch Marika waited for a while before slowly walking out of the conference room. The venue of the meeting was not any secret place in the Eastern Church, but the only 5-star hotel in the city. 4 knights stood neatly outside the room. Among them, Knight Tang Minger, one of the 4 commanders of the Knights of Light, was also there. Seeing Patriarch Marika walk out of the room, Knight Tang Minger bowed slightly. "Let's go back." Patriarch Marika smiled faintly. His voice was soft and magnetic, carrying an extremely powerful appeal. Tang Minger nodded and led the way, while the other 3 knights followed behind. The night was getting darker. It was quiet in the corridor of the hotel. In the warm light, light footsteps sounded. A tall woman walked over. Her skin was fair, but it was not the kind of white that Europeans had. She looked like a Eurasian, and her golden hair swayed gently as she walked. The woman's pace was very lazy, but it was extremely enchanting. Tang Minger looked at the woman's gently twisting body, and his eyes flashed with passion. The woman's appearance could not be regarded as a character, but she was very charming, and her every move was very seductive. Tang Minger's eyes were a little hot. In such a serious scene tonight, he suddenly thought of a few Eastern European noble ladies with whom he maintained a private relationship. Tang Minger shook his head in self-mockery, suppressed his inner desire, and glanced at the woman opposite him. Before the feeling of pity in his heart had subsided, a huge shock had already arisen. In his line of sight, the very elegant and feminine girl suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened, and she looked behind them with a face full of horror. Tang Minger instinctively sensed that something was wrong. Suddenly, a strange sound rang out from behind. The 4 knights turned around at the same time. A woman in a hotel uniform pushed a dining cart over, and her speed kept increasing. "Kill her!" Tang Minger suddenly shouted and rushed to the dining cart without hesitation. The 3 knights beside him followed him instinctively. "Go!" A weak voice suddenly sounded, but this voice sounded like thunder in Tang Minger's ears. It was the voice of Patriarch Marika. However, the voice stopped abruptly. Tang Minger suddenly turned around. In his sight, the woman who had covered her mouth with a frightened face put down her hand. A steel needle fell out of his sleeve. His palm was slender but extremely thick. It was clearly a man's palm. A thought flashed across Tang Minger's mind. Before he could move, the assassin who was dressed as a woman but looked so lifelike had already gotten close to Marika. The steel needle in his hand pierced through Marika's heart without hesitation. Countless electric arcs burst out in front of Marika's chest. They passed through his back and swept toward Tang Minger with a large amount of blood. Tang Minger pressed the alarm button in his hand and moved forward without hesitation. A shining tip of a sword pierced through his body from behind. The 3 knights beside the dining cart had already fallen. The woman in the uniform of a waiter held a long sword and pierced his heart. The assassin who killed Patriarch Marika took off his wig, mask, and women's clothes. The chaotic footsteps sounded. Countless knights of the Eastern Church rushed over. But he had completed the task and didn't care at all. Tang Mingers slowly fell down. A second before his life ended, he heard a voice. Your Highness Li Tianlan sends his regards to the Eastern Church. The drifting clouds were formless. Fearless and fearless. Free and unrestrained. The ruins in front of the Caesar Hotel had completely disappeared. Everything in the surroundings had been completely erased from the intense battle. The originally bustling street was empty. The world was dead silent. The wreckage of the corpses was scattered everywhere. The blood spread into a river and flowed under their feet. The rain was still falling. On the ground, the blood-colored ripples kept spreading, which looked vivid and strange. Arcis, an expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican, was already covered in blood. He sat alone in the corpse-strewn battlefield, panting heavily. In this spacious and silent world, his panting was extremely ear-piercing, sounding extremely gloomy. In his sight, everyone had fallen down and turned into corpses. Only he was still alive. In the empty city, a lonely person. In the distant sky, it was raining wildly. Arcis gasped and was in a daze. At this moment, he suddenly felt extremely lonely, as if he was standing at the highest point of the world. His whole body seemed to be filled with a kind of loneliness from the inside out. Arcis sat on the ground, took out a cigarette and lit it. For a moment, he was at a loss. Everything that happened tonight could be said to be the fiercest battle he had ever encountered in his life. But when the battle was over and the result was clear, what he felt was not joy, but confusion. King Tong's body fell in front of him. The blood covered her enchanting blonde hair, which looked extremely dirty. Beside King Tong, Paul, who only had a head left, died with his eyes open, but there was no sound. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, who had always been regarded as the biggest heretic by the Vatican, had his heart pierced by a sword. The murderous weapon, Dark Saint's Spear, which was famous in the Dark World, was in his hand at this time. The body of the master of Samsara Palace lay there in the distance, a little blurred. Arcis had always been curious about the master of Samsara Palace. But now that the battle was over, he suddenly didn't want to take a look at her. Situ Tsangyue died beside the master of Samsara Palace. And in front of the lord of Sai City, Tribulation's body was split in half. The famous sword was still sharp, but Qin Shilai had become flesh and blood all over the sky. Countless corpses spread out from under Aracis's feet. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Mitchell. Cass Rotter. Huan Kong. Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. All the invincible realm experts who could be named had turned into corpses. A little farther away, Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan, also lay there quietly without a sound. Arcis suddenly laughed. Everything tonight broke out in chaos and abruptness. In the battlefield of the Caesar Hotel, their side had an absolute advantage, and his arrival made the victory completely tilted to their side. Without any hesitation, Arcis did his best to attack as soon as he arrived. He killed Paul in the shortest time, and then killed the invincible realm experts of the Violet family and the Morton family. The heretic Hastile, who was known as the slaughterer in the eyes of the Vatican, surrendered to his power. And the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, the Men in Black and even the Snowdance Corps were all badly injured. After the coronation, Arcis, who was at the peak of his strength, did not hesitate to cooperate with the Snowdance Corps and kill Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Cass Rotter and Huan Kong also died under his absolute power. When only the Snowdance Corps was left on the battlefield, it was hard to say who would make the first move. The battle broke out without warning. In the end, Arcis killed all the strong enemies, including Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan. His strength completely transformed in the high-intensity battle and went further from the peak of the invincible realm. Now he was still in the state of coronation. He had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. In the state of coronation, he almost dared to fight with the real chosen one. His current strength had even surpassed that of Pope Monlier, who was known as the greatest in hundreds of years. Arcis laughed maniacally. "This is my dark world. I am the king of the dark world. The only king. Ha!" The crazy laughter kept echoing. Near Arcis, a middle-aged man in a red robe quietly watched Arcis go crazy. There was undisguised mockery in his eyes. This was a middle-aged man about 50 years old. His handsome face was pale at this time, but his eyes were still calm. He quietly looked at Arcis, who was in a state of madness. His eyes were calm and motionless, like a statue. "You should rest in your residence in the middle of the night. You shouldn't come here." A voice suddenly sounded and fell into the ears of the middle-aged man. It also fell into Arcis's ears. The extremely silent world was instantly filled with this voice. "I shouldn't come here, come here, here." The echo was mighty and kept echoing between heaven and earth. Arcis's face suddenly changed. He suddenly looked up at the sky and said angrily, "Who is it? I've been looking for you for a long time." A hand fell on the middle-aged man's shoulder. A white figure seemed to come out of nothingness and stood beside the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. Under the agitation of his emotions, he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Puff! In Arcis's sight, heaven and earth suddenly shook. A bloody wind whistled past, and a rain of blood suddenly floated between heaven and earth. Arcis was stunned, and his eyes were a little blank. "You," the middle-aged man stared at the white figure in front of him. He was very familiar with the dark world. So he had identified the other party's identity when he came out of nothingness without any power fluctuation. This was not the other party's martial arts. There was only one piece of clothing in the dark world that could have such a weird hiding ability. The Azure Dragon armor of Xianxia state. Naturally, there was only one person who could wear this suit. Azure Dragon of Xianxia state. Gong Sunqi, are you playing a monkey here? Gong Sunqi looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. Are you Patriarch Calendar? What do you want? Calendar, whose face was pale, said slowly. His mind, which had been tense all this while, was completely shattered. At the same time, the world in front of Arcis turned upside down. The rain of blood disappeared. All the corpses also disappeared. The whole world was filled with the sound of wind and rain. The scene was empty and calm. Not far away, the roar caused by the fierce battle was faintly discernible. The battle did not stop. Arcis was a little confused. I don't want anything. Gong Sunqi said blandly, Xianxia state says hello to you. He waved his hand. But Calendar, who had exhausted all his physical strength, directly exploded into a cloud of blood mist. Gong Sunqi watched the blood mist drift away expressionlessly. He suddenly looked up at Arcis and asked curiously, after the Pope's coronation, can you also be hypnotized? The corner of Arcis's mouth twitched, and his eyes became ashamed and furious in an instant. It was not until this moment that he realized what had happened. But this should not have happened at all. After the Pope's coronation, his will should have been extremely focused. But how could he be hypnotized by Calendar tonight and fall into his trap? Arcis looked around. The corpses around him disappeared. But everything around him was indeed extremely empty. All the buildings around him were completely razed to the ground by the tremendous force. There was no doubt that this was Arcis's masterpiece. In the state of hypnosis, all the enemies in front of Arcis were really strong. The fierce battle made him squander his strength without reservation. But in fact, he had been standing here by himself, showing his strength at the peak of the invincible realm to the air and the surrounding buildings. When the absurd emotions rose, all Arcis could feel was awkwardness. How is this possible? He didn't know why he was hypnotized in the state of coronation. But at this time he could clearly understand his state. In the illusion of hypnosis, all the enemies he met were really strong. After waking up from the confusion of squandering his power, Arcis's physical strength and willpower had fallen to the lowest point. At this moment, Arcis could even feel that the concentrated will of the Pope's coronation began to slowly decline. His peak period had been wasted by Calendar in the hypnosis. How was this possible? A mouthful of blood spurted out of Arasus's mouth. The blood on the corners of his mouth in anger directly affected his excessive injury, and Arasus's momentum suddenly dropped a lot. Gong Sun Chi's heart sank a lot. Arasus, who had almost no combat power in this state, was not at the peak of the invincible realm. Damn it! Arasus suddenly clenched his fists and growled, "The heretics of the Eastern Church deserve to die." There is another patriarch of the Eastern Church on the battlefield less than 5 kilometers away from here. Gong Sun Chi's voice was complicated. But in your current state, what can you do? Chapter 5:11. The emotions in Gong Sun Chi's tone were so complicated and tangled. Arasus could clearly hear the complexity in his words. It was contempt, disappointment, and disbelief. It was a lot of emotions that Arasus had never felt before. Almost in an instant, Arasus completely calmed down. Everything was a little abnormal tonight. Among the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, Patriarch Rock, the most low-key and pious controller, had profound attainments in the spiritual field. But now it seemed that Patriarch Calendar, the Destroyer, was no worse than Patriarch Rock in the spiritual field. This was a spiritual attainment close to the transcendent realm. If it got out, it would be enough to cause a stir in the dark world. Arasus had no time to think about these questions. The only thing he wanted to know was how he was hypnotized. He had been crowned by the Pope, and his spiritual will was flawless. The greatly improved willpower also made him more focused on using his power, so that his strength could leap again on the basis of the peak of the invincible realm. Strictly speaking, he could not be hypnotized after the Pope was crowned. It was impossible for Calendar to do this in any case. But in fact, the most impossible thing had happened. He had fought endlessly in the illusion set up by Calendar, wasted all his physical strength, and was even seriously injured. In the illusion, he was invincible and stood at the peak of the world. But Gong Sun Chi pulled him back to the cruelest and coldest reality. The street was empty and calm. The buildings destroyed by Arasus's great power turned into ruins and piled up on the ground. The roar of the battle in the distance was endless. Feeling the sense of weakness and powerlessness coming from all over his body, Arasus's face was ugly and cold. "How's the situation?" he asked suddenly. If Rothschild was destroyed tonight, many stories were bound to happen. But now Rothschild was still there, and Arasus had been trapped here for an unknown period of time. Under such circumstances, the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps were naturally still allies. "We lost," Gong Sun Chi said calmly. "In the battle tonight, the biggest accident was naturally that Paul exposed his strength that was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. It was also an accident that Arasus, who was crowned by the Pope, was hypnotized by Patriarch Calendar." Gong Sun Chi saw very clearly that Arasus had clearly fallen into an illusion and could not extricate himself. If he had not come, this block could be regarded as the spiritual world of Patriarch Calendar. If he had come a little later, Arasus would have been at risk of dying. The suppression in the spiritual realm was far more tragic than that of martial arts. Arasus could not distinguish between illusion and reality. In the end, he could only fall in the illusion with an unparalleled sense of accomplishment. The Patriarch of Eastern Europe was almost lucky enough to kill the expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican that night. What did this mean? Gong Sun Chi knew very well that there was definitely something wrong with it. But the question was no longer important. The most important thing was that Arasus couldn't appear on the battlefield immediately, so the entire battle began to tilt in favor of Rothschild. "Lost?" Arasus raised his thick eyebrows and roared in a low voice, "But the battle is not over yet." "Does it matter? Mitchell, Huan Kong, and Cass Rotter have all died. Qin Shilai and Tribulation have also been seriously injured and left the battlefield. Now on that battlefield, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile have teamed up with King Tong Paul to kill the elites of several major forces. The battle is indeed not over yet. That's because the army of Wulan State has not been killed. What about you? What can you do in your current state?" Arasus's face was pale. Every time Gong Sun Chi said a word, his heart sank a little. By the time Gong Sun Chi finished speaking, the Saint War Angel of the Vatican's heart had sunk to the bottom. In any case, he did not expect that the situation of this war had become so serious. The Snowdance Corps and Wulan State will make their last efforts. But if the general trend is really irresistible at the last moment, Zhongzhou State can only choose to give up Wulan State. As for the Vatican, Gong Sun Chi's eyes were cold and indifferent. Take care of yourself. The night wind blew over. Arcis suddenly felt a chill all over his body. But after all, he did not completely lose the ability to think. Gong Sun Chi's few words had already painted a picture of the battlefield and the future for him. You mean Violet, Morton, and the Eastern Church are joining hands with Rothschild? Gong Sun Chi did not speak and turned around expressionlessly. Aracis's eyes turned cold. At this moment, he did not think of Gong Sun Chi's rudeness, but the consequences if he lost the war tonight. The Snowdance Corps occupied Wulan State. Such a great advantage made Li Tianlan directly trigger the war tonight. Therefore, the Snowdance Corps could not afford to lose. Li Tianlan and the Li family could not afford to lose. Once they lost the war tonight, Li Tianlan and the Li family would be under tremendous pressure. But in the current situation, the Vatican could not afford to lose either. Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Violet, and Morton. Once the four of them occupied Wulan State together and took advantage of Wulan State to move westward, the elites of the entire Eastern Church could directly attack the Holy Land. The cooperation of the four forces could be said to be flawless. Rothschild could provide an incomparable foundation in Western Europe, and Paul was an absolute master who could restrain Arcis. The identity of the Eastern Church could always limit this invasion to the scope of a religious war, and it could also use the doctrines of the Eastern Church to influence the believers of the Vatican. The doctrines from the same Bible, even if there were differences, how big could they be? The Morton family could provide absolute wealth. Violet could use the unlimited political resources of Snow Country as a bargaining chip. It was not that the Vatican could not withstand such a lineup, but the significance of this matter did not lie in whether the Vatican could withstand it or not. For the Vatican, as long as the Eastern Church stepped into Western Europe, every time they developed a believer, it was a failure of the Vatican. At that time, the mystery of the Vatican and the majesty of the Saint War Angel would become a joke. Arcis hated it when someone made fun of him. Although he became a joke tonight, only Gong Sun Chi could see it. If the Vatican failed tonight, his joke would be seen by the whole world. Aracis's eyes became colder and colder. Do you look down on me? He asked suddenly. Gong Sun Chi's figure was about to disappear under the cover of the Azure Dragon armor. Hearing this, his figure paused slightly and turned around again. What you did tonight is not worthy of respect. Gong Sun Chi said calmly, at least as an ally, I can't understand. Arcis nodded. His expression was serious and calm. This is an accident, but everything can be reversed. A crimson pill appeared in his hand. The pill was dark and scarlet, looking extremely strange. Without any hesitation, Arcis swallowed the pill. The red pill melted in his mouth, and then it was like a fire that suddenly burned. The burning feeling flowed down his throat and burned his whole body. Aracis's body trembled violently, as if he was suffering great pain. His pale face turned ruddy in an instant, and an unparalleled violent momentum burst out. The domain of the peak of the invincible realm began to condense toward him. In an instant, a gust of wind was set off on the empty street. Gong Sun Chi stood on the edge of the domain. He was the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm under the invincible realm, and he had the strongest combat capability of the invincible realm. Even if Li Tianlan rose, Gong Sun Chi was still the strongest under the invincible realm. But the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm couldn't help but shake under the fluctuation of this domain, and he seemed to be a little unstable. Arcis closed his eyes and endured the pain in his body that almost tore his soul apart. The extremely violent effect lasted for about 10 minutes. Arcis slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were calm, and his aura was completely calm. Let's go. Arcis glanced at Gong Sun Chi. Let's go and have a look. This is Gong Sun Chi opened his mouth, but he didn't finish his words. In the dark world, there were many gene potions that could support experts to fight in various environments. Among them, there were many magical drugs that could temporarily restore the combat capability of seriously injured people. In many cases, this often meant another extra life. But such drugs were often only suitable for those below the invincible realm. There were very few drugs that could make an invincible realm expert recover from his injury and return to the peak state in an instant, and they were often accompanied by various sequelae, such as blurred willpower, confusion of friends and foes, and the more serious ones might even lower the realm. But the red pill in Erisis's hand obviously had no restrictions. He, who had returned to the peak state in an instant, could distinguish between friends and foes. In such a situation he dared to take the pill, which even showed that he didn't need to pay too much later. Such a drug should be a treasure even in the Wang family of Beihai, which had the most powerful gene potion technology. The Vatican's research in this regard was not as good as that of the Wang family of Beihai, and compared with other developed countries, it had no advantage. What kind of drug was this? This is the latest achievement of the Vatican. There is only one of it, and it's with me. The muscles at the corners of Erisis's mouth twitched. This red pill was naturally not as good as the immortality potion, but it could make a seriously injured expert at the peak of the invincible realm return to the peak combat capability in an instant, which was enough to show how powerful it was. The code name of this medicine, Redemption, could be said to be the highest achievement of the Vatican in this regard. This was originally one of Erisis's trump cards. In his plan, this should have been the trump card to face Wang Tianzong in the final decisive battle in the chaos of Eastern Europe. But now, because of the Eastern Church, this redemption was wasted here. Because he couldn't afford to lose. Tonight, it was even more impossible for him to withdraw from Wulan state and let the Eastern Church enter Western Europe to touch the Holy Land. These heretics really deserve to die. Arsis narrowed his eyes, and there was infinite killing intent in them. At this moment, he did not deliberately show his strength, but he stood there, and he was already indomitable. Gong Sun Chi took a deep look at Arsis. After a long time, he bowed slightly and said, "Gong Sun Chi pays respect to your highness." Arsis did not speak. The suffocating sense of oppression in the field was still there. However, his figure had already disappeared. Gong Sun Chi stood up and looked at the sky. In the night, a violent and ostentatious killing intent roared and surged all the way away. Gong Sun Chi was silent for a long time before he slowly turned around. A gentle and quiet voice suddenly sounded behind him without warning. The voice was very, very close behind Gong Sun Chi. "Third brother? Did you kill Calland?" Gong Sun Chi's face changed dramatically, and he suddenly turned around. The surprise attack of freezing Snow City was like a real war. After the fighting, the explosion, and the flying blood fell, the sword light retracted, and the vast manor returned to peace. The war broke out abruptly. It also ended abruptly. In the Battle of Reki City, Violet took away more than 60% of the elite forces of the Violet family. In order to maintain the stability of Snow City, some of the experts in the manor were scattered all over the city. The most important thing was that the departure of Violet himself made the Violet family lose its most powerful deterrent. Under such circumstances, the sharpness of the Xianyuan sword troop was almost completely released from the very beginning. The pulse weapons cleared the field as soon as possible, and the remaining experts were few after the first charge of the Xianyuan sword troop. The heavenly fairy of Ling Shuangxue, the first elder of Jade Pool, blocked the counterattack of the fog defense system of the Violet family's headquarters. This was just the beginning. As soon as an expert of the half-step invincible realm and an expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm of the Violet family appeared, a sword strike that was more ruthless and decisive than the heavenly fairy had already broken out inside the manor. The famous sword snowblowing, heaven-shattering rainbow. With just one sword strike, the two strongest experts of the Violet family who stayed at the headquarters tonight had been smashed into pieces. From the attack to the patriarch of the Violet family, the raid of Xianyuan sword took less than half an hour from beginning to end. On this night, The most important figures of the supreme violet family in Snow Country were all exposed to the sharpness of the jade pool. Without any defensive measures, when facing death, the rich and powerful families were also trembling with fear. The blood beads on the snow blowing flowed down and dripped on the expensive carpet. Xianxia, who had only made one sword strike in the whole war, quietly looked at the crowd crawling at his feet. The patriarch of the Violet family, Tovo Granaski Violet, and all the important figures of the Violet family in the headquarters. The old patriarch of the Violet family, who was paralyzed in bed at the age of 80. Tovo's 2 younger sisters. An elder brother. In addition, there were a few children who looked no more than 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, all the members of the Violet family were huddled together, looking at Xianxia with undisguised fear and hatred in their eyes. Mr. Su. A captain of the Xianyuan sword troop came over and said expressionlessly, "I've checked. In addition to the Violet family, there are 8 other members of the Violet family who are not here. They are all very important figures, and 2 of them are in Snow City. Send someone to kill them," Xianxia said in a flat tone. The captain nodded, turned around, and went to deploy. Xianxia's eyes fell on Tovo, the patriarch of the Violet family. He was silent for a while before he said calmly, "So, in tonight's raid, we actually only captured you, the most valuable hostage? There's nothing we can't talk about." Tovo took a deep breath. He was still in his pajamas. When the Xianyuan sword troops raided the manor, he happened to take off the clothes of a young female counselor who had recently been trained to be very obedient. He waved his hand, stood up tentatively, and said slowly and sincerely, "People of China, the Violet family is very willing to be friends with you. We can talk. I can call my wife now. She will come back with the elites of the family. No, she can even help you. You want to deal with Rothschild? Violet can help you." A member of the Xianyuan sword army came over, took a photo, and then retreated. "You can't kill me. It will destroy the relationship between Snow Country and Zhongzhou State. If we cooperate, all of Eastern Europe will be ours. Your young marshal has great power. He is a strong man. I'm willing to share Eastern Europe with the strong. Time will prove that cooperating with the Violet family is the best choice." Xianxia glanced at the elite who had just retreated. The other side nodded expressionlessly. Xianxia also nodded and glanced at Tovo. "Are you done?" Tovo's pupils shrank sharply. "Time will prove that killing you tonight is the best choice," Xianxia said calmly. The snow-blowing sword made a very bright arc of light in the air. The arc of light flashed and then disappeared. A few drops of blood splashed out. A line of blood suddenly bloomed on Tovo's throat. The blood spurted out, looking strange and bloody. What right does a patriarch who is willing to hand over the power of the family to a woman have to talk about cooperation? Xianxia said indifferently. There was a sudden exclamation in the gorgeous hall. The rest of the old people, children, and women all huddled together, shivering. Xianxia glanced at them. "Senior brother, what should we do with these people?" Ling Shuangxue came over and asked. Xianxia's eyes shifted from the children to the old people. There was a touch of hesitation in his eyes. "I can't get in touch with His Highness now," he said slowly. "Maybe these people can be used to threaten Violet?" Ling Shuangxue did not speak. There were indeed 2 children born to Tovo and Violet, a boy and a girl. The boy was close to adulthood, and the girl was only 5 years old this year. It was a good choice to use to threaten Violet. But Li Tianlan didn't seem to think about this problem from the beginning. His order was very simple, that was, to destroy the entire Violet family. No matter who won or lost the battle in Reki City tonight, the Violet family and the Morton family were bound to disappear in Eastern Europe. If the Snowdance Corps won, the Qin clan and Rekvia would get more and greater benefits in Eastern Europe in the future. Xianxia looked at the group of old, young, women and children in front of him, and his eyes were a little shaken. He saw cowardice, fear, and hatred in their eyes. After all, he was just a swordsman who lived in Jade Pool and rarely went down the mountain. Now he had destroyed the Violet family, but in the face of this group of old, young, women, and children who had no power to fight back, he was at a loss for a moment. The elites of Xianyuan swords slowly walked into the hall. They were also looking at this group of people who had no power to fight back, their eyes cold and silent. Su Chang'e suddenly felt a little sick. He shook his head hard and said, "I'll make a phone call." "Can't you get in touch with His Highness?" Ling Shuangxue asked. Su Chang'e shook his head. "I'll call Rushi. Maybe His Highness has other arrangements." The phone was quickly connected. Dongqing Rushi's clear voice sounded very soft. "Master?" Su Chang'e's inner struggle gradually calmed down. He smiled and said gently, "It's me." Dongqing Rushi said honestly, "Tianlan is not here. How are things on your side?" "Everything is going well." Su Chang'e looked back at the crowded hostages, sighed softly, and said, "I still have some old people and children of the Violet family in my hands. They are all very important people. Rushi, does His Highness have any other arrangements?" Dongqing Rushi also fell silent. Obviously, she also understood the meaning of this sentence. Su Chang'e quietly waited for Dongqing Rushi's answer. "They are all enemies." After a long time, Dongqing Rushi said softly, "But these are old people and children." Su Chang'e subconsciously raised his voice. "The youngest child is less than 2 years old this year. After all, he couldn't accept what might happen next, so he directly expressed his position." Dongqing Rushi was silent. There was silence on the other end of the phone. After a long time, in the silence, Dongqing Rushi hung up the phone. She didn't respond to Su Chang'e's words in the end. No response was actually a kind of response. Su Chang'e's body was a little cold. He stood there for a long time, then glanced at Ling Shuangxue and said in a low voice, "Let's go." The 2 swordsmen of Mount Shu slowly walked out. The elites of the Xianyuan sword troop stood quietly. The temperature in the hall became gloomy and cold. The door slowly closed. A child's cry suddenly sounded in the room. Sword intent spread out in the hall. The screams lasted for a moment and then disappeared. Su Chang'e didn't look back. He stepped on the flagstone road of the manor. Wherever he walked, a line of deep footprints was branded on the flagstone road, deep and clear. "Senior brother?" Ling Shuangxue hesitated. Su Chang'e slowly shook his head and suddenly said, "Let's go back." Ling Shuangxue was a little confused. She opened her charming and extremely moving eyes wide. "Go back to Zhongzhou State," Su Chang'e said in a low voice. He straightened his body and subconsciously looked in the direction of Reki City. In Reki City, Dongqing Rushi stood in front of the window and looked at the extremely deep night outside. The screen of the phone that hung up completely dimmed. The wind and rain were messy. She stood quietly. In the distant sky, the deep night seemed to turn into an extremely dark shadow. The shadow slowly drifted over and seemed to completely envelop Dongqing Rushi. In the gradually slanting sunlight, a black Rolls-Royce slowly drove into the hidden Dragon Sea and finally stopped in front of Jinqiu Pavilion. There was no secretary in front of the solemn gate of Jinqiu Pavilion. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State stood at the door and looked at the approaching Rolls-Royce with a smile. A silent woman with an extremely fierce aura quickly got out of the car and opened the back door of the Rolls-Royce. Summer Solstice, the wife of the patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, walked out of the car and shook hands with Li Huaqing with a smile. She said softly, "Mr. President, sorry to bother you." "Madam, you don't have to be so polite." Li Huaqing shook his head with a smile and reached out his hand. "Please." The hostess of the Wang family of Beihai, who had never stepped into the hidden Dragon Sea for more than 20 years, smiled lightly. But there was a kind of sharpness that seemed to have been forgotten gradually coming out of her. She was dignified and elegant, but irresistible. At the same time, under the sky of Beihai, in the laboratory of Mount Dibing, beside the huge bronze tripod, Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silent for a long time in the dark world and even in Zhongzhou State, put a box in the bronze tripod with a solemn face. The gigantic coldness of the 9 states stood there quietly, but the natural sword qi broke through the extremely sturdy box without anyone activating it. A black arm guard came out of the box. The arm guard began to spread slowly, with unparalleled spirituality, and wrapped around the coldness of 9 states. The broad body of the coldness of 9 states suddenly buzzed. In an instant, invisible but extremely sharp sword energy flew in every corner of the laboratory hall. Wang Xiaoyao watched this scene quietly. The black sword kept trembling. On the body of the sword, the sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to be alive and became extremely vivid. The sword energy became more and more violent, but it was extremely sharp and clear. Looking at this scene, Wang Xiaoyao suddenly felt a little emotional. This was the first fusion of the divine weapon and the murderous weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. At this moment, was the human emperor moving? Or was the coldness of 9 states moving? He pressed a button beside him. A light shield gradually rose from the huge bronze tripod. The misty blue light rose and gradually enveloped the human emperor and the coldness of 9 states. It was sunny in Linen. The former lonely mountain had become today's Southeast Supervisory Council. The main building of the Supervisory Council had been completed. The engineering corps from the Lin and military region were still repairing other facilities in the Supervisory Council day and night. Li Honghe, dressed in plain clothes, sat quietly on a bluestone in the Supervisory Council, facing West Lake, silently watching the sun gradually setting in the west. In the dim light and shadow, an old man with a serious and dignified expression appeared. Li Honghe was stunned and smiled softly. The old man was followed by a few meticulous guards. The guards didn't stop until they got close to Li Honghe. The old man came over and sat down beside Li Honghe. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "Can't sit still?" Li Honghe glanced at him and said with a soft laugh. "Reki City," the old man frowned tightly. "The situation is not good." "No, for us, the situation tonight is the best." Li Honghe smiled and suddenly said, "Do you believe me or not?" The old man glanced at him and thought, "Is it nonsense?" Li Honghe seemed to have gotten the answer. He nodded and said, "Since you believe me, stay for dinner tonight. When this big show is over, everything should be clear." At the same time, it was almost evening in Zhongzhou State. In the strong wind and heavy rain at Reki City International Airport, Qin Weibai also boarded the plane to Lin and Zhongzhou State. There was no flaming fire beside her. There was no Lin Fengting. She was alone. Chapter 5:12. There was another chapter before last night at 12 o'clock. The situation took a turn for the worse in the blink of an eye. When the red light that filled the sky suddenly erupted and slowly dissipated, the situation of the entire battlefield became incomparably clear. However, Cass Rotter's sudden disappearance from the battlefield still gave everyone a clear sense of astonishment. Tonight, more than one invincible realm expert died in the battle. But Cass Rotter's death gave everyone a different feeling. It might even be completely different. Cass Rotter was the god of war of Star State. He was an expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. He ranked in the top 10 of the divine list and held the murderous weapon Holy Punishment of Void. In this state, Cass Rotter might not be able to sweep the Dark World. But in the Dark World, he was absolutely fearless. No one expected him to fall here. And in such a strange way. A huge sense of confusion struck everyone's heart. It was not only Raphael, Mellad and Sidu Tsangyue who were stunned. Even Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and even Patriarch Hastile, who had been taken care of by the occupation, were stunned. At this moment, regardless of friend or foe, everyone felt a sense of sympathy. Cass Rotter was the most important person to fall tonight. His death was destined to cause a great disturbance in the Dark World. Even Star State, which had been slowly increasing its national power in recent years, would be greatly impacted. Paul's expression was calm, but sweat flowed down the back of his head and into his collar. The weight of a murderous weapon was undoubtedly extremely heavy, especially the Void Divine Punishment. Among the 12 malefic weapons, the Holy Punishment of Void was not the most powerful, but that was under normal circumstances. In the past 10 years, the Void Godly Punishment had not been fired even once. After accumulating energy for 10 years, the power of the holy punishment of void was definitely far beyond its normal state. At such a close distance, if the spear fell on Paul, he would be seriously injured on the spot, or even completely lose his combat capability. He would need a long period of recuperation in the future to save his life, and it was still unknown whether he could recover or not. This was the most normal situation. But now, the great danger had completely disappeared in a way that no one could have imagined. Paul did not feel relieved. Instead, he suddenly felt uneasy. Until now, he finally saw the situation of the Dark World clearly. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. The balance of the four families was broken, which eventually led to the current chaos in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe affects the whole world. Now that the chaos in Eastern Europe had not been pacified, Rothschild had completely become enemies with all the major forces. If Rothschild won tonight, Rothschild would inevitably gather the Shadow Throne with the general trend. Kyle would join forces with the Violet Morton family and cooperate with the Eastern Church to take down the Vatican. If Rothschild failed tonight, the Vatican would definitely attack Rothschild fiercely when it increased the speed of devouring the Eastern Church. The situation had already reached this point. After shedding all pretense of cordiality, there was no possibility of reconciliation between the two sides. From another perspective, in the chaos of Eastern Europe, Western Europe was bound to fall into extreme chaos after tonight, no matter who won or lost. Now that Cass Rotter, the god of war of Star Nation, and Huan Kong, the lord of Fantasy World, had died here at the same time, the vast North America was equivalent to losing two pillars overnight. North America would not be peaceful anymore. The probing of outsiders and the internal battles would also be exciting. Further south, South America. Jiang Qiansong was expelled from the Jiang family of South America. The Heroes Club had lost Mitchell. It was foreseeable that South America would not be peaceful either. As for Asia. As for Tiannan, it was the battlefield of the Wang family of Beihai and the purgatory of Heaven capital. But the land of Tiannan was involved in the sites of Zhongzhou State, East Island, and Annan State. Inside East Island, Jifeng Sword Raining School and Wuji Palace were fighting against the purgatory of Heaven capital. Inside Zhongzhou State, the hidden danger of the Wang family of Beihai was becoming more and more obvious. With the rise of the Li family, the atmosphere in Zhongzhou State began to become strange. It was not until this moment that Paul was shocked to find that after the battle tonight, there was no pure land in the Dark World. When all the superpowers began to become chaotic, some of the weaker ones would definitely feel that they had a chance to rise. After tonight, the whole Dark World would fall into an incomprehensible chaos. Looking at the Dark World in recent decades or even hundreds of years, it seemed that such a situation had never occurred. It was like the madness before the end of the world. The general trend had formed a vortex that swallowed the whole Dark World with Eastern Europe as the core. There was no way to stop struggling in this vortex, whether it was people or forces. They could only go crazy hysterically. All of this was like a conspiracy without a purpose. Paul suddenly felt very cold inside. At this moment, at least tonight, Rothschild was already standing in the center of the vortex. The surging general trend was surging wildly. Under the general trend, Paul felt that he and even Rothschild were incomparably small. If all this was a conspiracy, then what did the person behind the scenes who made all this want? Paul's face turned a little pale unconsciously. "Brother!" King Tong let out a soft cry. Bang! Countless rays of light suddenly bloomed in front of him. The brilliant and scorching light was spinning wildly in front of him. The silent battlefield was completely broken in an instant. The light of heaven of Patriarch Hostile kept condensing in his hand, and dozens of thick light pillars kept falling. The moment the light pillars lit up, the crazy killing intent had already rushed to Situ Tsangyue. A huge black shield appeared in front of Situ Tsangyue at the same time. The dark saint spear kept changing its shape in the violent light. Raphael could hardly communicate with Situ Tsangyue. The loud roar and ubiquitous attacks completely covered her in an instant. In the blazing white light, Violet and Lagos attacked at the same time, almost regardless of the cost. In such an obvious situation, Everyone could clearly see one thing. If they killed Raphael and Situtungyu, Reki City would be theirs. As for Mellad, who was the weakest, they didn't care about him anymore. The light completely drowned Raphael and Situtungyu. The huge force fiercely hit the Dark Saint Spear, and Raphael could even hear the constant wailing of the Dark Saint Spear. In a hurry, Raphael's domain was opened with all his might. The world was silent for a moment, and Raphael quickly said, "Kill one first." Mellad attacked with all his might. He was originally standing behind Situtungyu, but at this time, he took a step forward. Soft and pure light kept flowing out of his fingers. The light surged in the night sky and merged with the light of heaven. The pressure on the Dark Saint Spear was instantly reduced. The pure light formed a door in front of Raphael and Situtungyu. The door turned into a wall, blocking all the attacks from all directions. The unique skill of the Vatican, refuge. Hurry up! The surging power crashed into Melad's body. Blood spurted out of Melad's mouth. His face was a little ferocious, and there was an obvious urge in his simple voice. In an instant, the Dark Saint Spear changed from a shield to a long saber. The long black saber spread wildly, and the pitch-black saber light instantly covered 100 meters. An incomparably sharp saber light shattered all the light in front of Hastile. The pitch-black saber light continued to move forward. It almost brushed past Hastile's body and directly slashed at Violet, who was the weakest among them. The saber light, which was dozens of meters long, locked onto Violet's figure. The domain and the saber light burst out at almost the same time. It was pitch-black but dazzling. This move was called Dark Gospel. This move was called Death Harvest. All the power surged out of Raphael's body as he took a step forward. Blood began to seep out of the pores on his body, but as soon as the blood appeared, it was completely evaporated by the high temperature of his body. Raphael's eyes were ferocious. This was his most extreme move at the moment. It erupted in an instant, and it was as if he was either dead or alive. The saber light was surging. Wherever the pitch-black edge passed, the night sky seemed to be split in half, and all the air was crazily squeezed toward the surroundings. The space was distorted to the extreme. In the dull roar, it continued to explode and burn. The flames fell from the sky to the ground. On the ground, the major forces were still fighting. As the flames fell, an invincible realm expert of the Violet family was instantly burned to ashes. Violet's body was completely stiff. It wasn't that she didn't want to move, but that she couldn't move at all. Everything about her had been locked by Raphael. The domain was his will, and the saber light was his power. In a desperate situation, this move had reached the perfection that Raphael had never achieved. Violet couldn't move her body, nor could she use the domain. This desperate move completely showed the absolute suppression of an expert in the middle of the divine list against an expert in the middle of the holy list. Raphael's eyes were scarlet, and he was completely crazy. Not long ago, Tribulation's desperate move was not completely fruitless. He used the most direct and most dangerous method to detonate a space that was completely out of control. Needless to say, he was injured, but in that uncontrollable and unpredictable space, Paul was also seriously injured. The most important thing was that his physical strength had been greatly consumed. During the period when he almost didn't do anything but was recovering his physical strength, it was the best opportunity for Raphael. Without Violet, their pressure would be reduced to a considerable extent. Then, they would have the hope of breaking out of the encirclement. Breaking out of the encirclement, Raphael gave a wry smile. He didn't even have time to sigh with emotion that the tables had turned. The saber in his hand had already been pressed down crazily. The saber slashed in the air. A crack could be clearly seen in the empty night sky. Raphael suddenly raised his head. In his sight, Paul stretched out his hand and grabbed at the air. Violet's body was suddenly torn by a huge force and pulled out of the domain. Without any hesitation, Raphael stabbed straight with his saber. Violet, who had gotten rid of the shackles, looked at Raphael with resentment and soared into the sky without hesitation. There seemed to be a meteor streaking across the distant sky. The meteor burned with flames and broke through the sky from the distant sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, A surging and violent force had filled the entire sky. And Violet had just risen. The falling meteor seemed to have found its target and directly crashed into Violet. The huge force brought up one storm after another, and the speed of the meteor suddenly accelerated. It was filled with killing intent, anger, and determination. Violet's pupils instantly widened. The meteor in her sight became clearer and clearer. At this moment, she could only scream, "No!" However, before he could finish his sentence, the meteor had already collided with Pooh. In Violet's sight, there was an extremely clear and profound figure. Bang! In Violet's incomparably shrill and desperate scream, the meteor rushed past her. Violet looked down at herself in a daze. The corner of her mouth moved. Puff! With a dull sound, her body was directly exploded by the huge force, and her whole body turned into a mist of blood. The meteor landed on the ground and looked at Paul quietly. King Tong was stunned for a long time before she suddenly exclaimed, "Our sis!" Chapter 5:13. The battle in the sky and on the ground did not subside with Violet's death. Instead, it became even crazier. The ink-like shadows in Paul's hands condensed into a substance and turned into countless swords, rushing towards Raphael without any pause. Mellad stood together with Situ Tsangyu. Under the suppression of Patriarch Hostile, the pure light in the sanctuary continued to shrink and was almost completely gone. King Tong's domain completely enveloped the battlefield in the air. The space around Lagos was constantly twisting, as if it was accumulating power. The fighting on the ground seemed to be never-ending. The elites of Rothschild had already arrived at the battlefield. The elites of the Morton family, the Violet family, and the Knights Templar were also fighting. The army of Wulan State still seemed endless. The Masters of the Vatican, the Dark Knights, the Holy Disarmament Corps, the Heroes Club, the Fantasy World, and the Men in Black were fighting with the enemy under the cover of the army of Wulan State. Thunder and raging fire kept breaking out in the crowd, and the momentum was terrifying. However, it was only a frightening display. The combined power of the major forces on the ground was definitely stronger than the allies of Rothschild. However, experts of the invincible realm kept falling, which made the cooperation of the superpowers extremely chaotic. In addition, when Violet first appeared, he slaughtered the experts of the superpowers, which made everyone fearful when fighting. 3 of the 7 deadly sins of the Dark Knights, who were famous in the Dark World, had died in battle. More than half of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican died. Mitchell was the first Invincible Realm expert to die, so the elites of the Heroes Club had almost been wiped out. Fantasy World and the Man in Black were completely out of their wits. They were only subconsciously fighting each other. Erisis's figure fell heavily to the ground. An energy wave visible to the naked eye spread out violently with him as the center. The bodies of several knights of the Radiance Knight Regiment closest to him were directly shattered. Some of Violet's broken bones and flesh slowly fell to the ground, but they were fiercely scattered by this force. King Tong's exclamation rang out, but no one on the battlefield seemed to notice this scene. It wasn't that she didn't notice it. To be exact, she was already numb to it. Mitchell, Huan Kong, Cass Rotter, Violet. The general trend of the Dark World had never stopped. But throughout the history of the Dark World for nearly 100 years, there had never been a war that could make an invincible realm expert so fragile and fall so easily. From shock to numbness, now everyone had gone completely crazy. Erisis's eyes were cold and ruthless. A berserk aura surged around him. He fixed his eyes on several invincible realm experts for the first time. Paul immediately sensed a huge pressure coming at him. Erisis's voice rang out, shaking the sky and spreading out majestically. This voice was loud and sonorous, and its dignity carried undisguised brutality and rage. Heresy! You, all guilty! Whoosh! Out of instinct, Raphael's power erupted in an instant. After temporarily getting rid of Paul's entanglement, he retreated without hesitation. He was the leader of the Knights of Darkness. His most well-known achievement in the Dark World was not how well he developed the Dark Knights, nor was it his past achievements that shocked the Dark World. The biggest thing he was known to have done was to be able to escape unscathed from Arsis after provoking the Pope in the European sanctuary. And that was the uncrowned Arsis. He knew how powerful Arsis was. Paul was also very powerful. Raphael didn't want to get involved in the battle between people of this level, not at all. His body glided through the air. Almost at the same time, Melad's body suddenly lit up. Countless pure flowing lights continued to condense. The defensive light wall in front of Melad was instantly thickened countless times and was completely indestructible. This was not Melad's refuge. It was the unique skill to upgrade the refuge. Divine Protection. Arsis, who had taken action to share Melad's pressure in the blink of an eye, appeared directly in front of Paul the moment the light appeared. He had no domain. However, the torrential power tore through the sky in an instant and shattered the shadows. His figure looked extremely tall and majestic in the process of charging. He was like a god. He was the Saint War Angel of the Vatican. And now, he was the Saint War Angel in a state of fury. One punch. In an instant, as Arsis waved his fist, the void within a radius of thousands of meters suddenly exploded. The extremely terrifying power came from all directions with a crazy tearing airflow. The domain that King Tong had condensed with all her strength suddenly shattered. Paul's body became clear for a moment. The pure light suddenly bloomed. Arsis, who was surrounded by holy light, punched Paul again. There was still no domain. There was still no sword intent. Aris's movements were extremely simple and straightforward. Every move of his was filled with crazy surging power. He ranked first in close combat in the Dark World. He didn't need the so-called domain. No matter whose domain he was in, as long as he got close, his surroundings would be his world. King Tong's domain was completely suppressed. A mouthful of blood spurted out of King Tong's mouth, and her face instantly turned pale. Paul's body flashed in an instant. The domain around him condensed and spread, and it condensed with the domain that King Tong had burst out again. The obscure and dark shadow was mighty, and even the light on Aris's body seemed to be no longer pure. When the two of them joined forces, this was the perfect domain. In this domain, Paul was also at the peak of the invincible realm. Aris's body rushed straight over. Straightforward. Simple. Violent. It looked very cumbersome, but it carried an unimaginable swiftness and fierceness. Shadow slaughter. The small shadow on Paul's body kept fluctuating, and his figure disappeared in an instant. The next second, Arsis turned around and hit him with his elbow without hesitation. Bang! It was like the most casual collision, but the solid space was like a fragile mirror that was shattered one after another. The light and the shadow were entangled wildly. A large area of the night sky turned into nothingness, and then fell into the purest darkness. Paul took 2 steps back. His face was slightly pale, but he steadied himself. Aris's pupils shrank slightly, and he turned around and rushed to King Tong without hesitation. Paul was very strong. But King Tong was the key. King Tong's domain completely made up for the weakness of Paul's domain in the state of shadow slaughter, and then made his combat capability reach the peak of the invincible realm, which was not inferior to Aris's. As long as he killed King Tong, Arsis was 100% sure that he could kill Paul tonight. The shadow fluctuated slightly. Paul seemed to have crossed the space and appeared directly in front of Arsis. Leg sweep. Forward punch. Throat lock. Around the back. In the shadow domain, Paul's body had completely turned into a dark optical fiber. His figure seemed to appear in all directions of Arsis at the same time, and the cold killing intent burst out from the trickiest angle. Arsis didn't dodge or evade. He attacked head-on, and all of Paul's attacks were taken by him. Forward. His footsteps were extremely firm. In Paul's crazy attack, he went straight forward and rushed to King Tong. Buzz. A buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the void that had become extremely chaotic but had become incomparably quiet. Red light suddenly appeared. The blade of Ghost Hand appeared in front of Arsis almost in the blink of an eye. Bang! Aris's body suddenly twisted, and he smashed his fist on the blade of Ghost Hand. The light that almost dispelled the whole night burst out in an instant. Arsis suddenly roared, and endless light burst out around him. The light that was condensed to the extreme suppressed the perfect domain created by Paul and King Tong. The shadow was retreating. The light was moving forward. It was so difficult to move forward and backward, but it obviously existed. A unique skill. The forbidden spell of heaven. This was a domain. But it was not Aris's own domain. It was the strongest domain in the Vatican for hundreds of years, and it could also be said to be the most powerful unique skill. This was the unique skill of His Majesty Monlier, the greatest pope of the Vatican hundreds of years ago. Once the forbidden spell of heaven reached its limit, it had the terrifying power to kill someone at the peak of the invincible realm in an instant. At the peak of this unique skill, the Vatican even had clear records that its power was infinitely close to that of the Chosen One. Aris's strength was far inferior to that of His Majesty Monlier in the past. But at this moment, this forbidden spell of heaven was already the domain of the peak of the invincible realm, and it was also his strongest trump card outside of close combat. End the battle as soon as possible. Tonight had brought Arsis too many surprises and humiliation. He didn't want to waste time with anyone. As long as King Tong died, everyone would die. Arsis roared wildly. A lot of blood flowed down from his body, but the situation that broke out soared again. Another ray of light that was slightly dimmer but equally pure shot over from afar. Unique skill, commandment of light. Under the circumstances that he couldn't reveal his true strength, this was Melit's strongest move. The pure light completely combined with the forbidden spell of heaven. The difficult and barely balanced balance was completely broken in an instant. The faces of Paul and King Tong changed dramatically at the same time. The situation of the whole battlefield was instantly reversed. Paul, King Tong, Lagos, and Hastile. For invincible realm experts. Arsis, Mellad, Siditsongyue, and Raphael. They were also 4 invincible realm experts. But in the case of Arsis fighting 1 against 2, Lagos and Hastile's combat capability was almost equal to that of Raphael and Siditsongyue's. Mellad, the weakest invincible realm expert on the surface, suddenly became the key to the key. The commandment of light and the forbidden spell of heaven were completely combined, and it was extremely perfect. Aris's eyes were cold. The infinite light instantly soared, almost drowning everything. All the shadows disappeared in an instant. Arsis stamped his feet hard. Go to hell, all of you. The strong light tore through the sky. The void within a radius of a kilometer had been completely illuminated. In the night of Reki City under the heavy rain. It was as if a bright sun had suddenly risen. The light swept past. Paul's body was suddenly sent flying for nearly 100 meters, and a mouthful of blood spurted out of his mouth. King Tong was covered in blood, and her aura plummeted. Arsis took a step forward. In an instant, a silver edge suddenly lit up in the aftermath of the light. The silver edge was so small in the aftermath of the mighty light. But it was so sharp. The sword light was hidden. The combination of sword intent and sword energy was incomparably perfect. The focused and sharp light tore apart the mighty aftermath of the light in an instant. The sharp sword edge stabbed straight at King Tong. The sword light arrived in an instant. Sea-breaking style. Be careful. It's Li Tianlan. Paul suddenly roared crazily. But the silver light that suddenly appeared was like a meteor. Just as King Tong wanted to dodge, the long sword had already come to her face. Puff! With a slight sound, the blade directly pierced through King Tong's body. Blood spurted out. At the same time, an earth-shattering roar completely suppressed the chaos on the battlefield. Snowdance Corps. Charge! Outside the battlefield, in the darkness farther away, a figure, who had been hiding outside the perception range of the invincible realm experts, also stepped out of the darkness. Chapter 5:14. Blood flew out under the silver light, and the scarlet blood light looked extremely sad. This sword strike came suddenly. It was not earth-shattering, but it had an extremely condensed penetrating power. The remaining forbidden spell of heaven and the Shadow Kingdom were directly torn apart the moment the sword edge swept past. The silver light flashed away. As soon as Paul's roar sounded, the silver sword light had directly passed through King Tong's body, going through her front and back. Blood spurted and fell down. King Tong's figure was also falling. The silver flowing light bloomed and gathered, pushing King Tong's body to the ground. Wherever the silver sword light passed, the remaining domain was shattered. But the shattering was extremely small. As the sword light passed, the domain slowly closed again. This sword strike was like a light spot in the darkness. It was small, subtle, but bright, dazzling, and extremely perfect. King Tong's body fell hard to the ground. The messy battlefield suddenly shook, and countless cracks appeared on the ground centered on King Tong. Blood almost flowed out of control from the corners of King Tong's mouth. She moved her body, but she couldn't get up. The sword edge of falling stars pierced through her body, and the edge went through the middle of her chest and abdomen, straight and sharp. Although this sword was not aimed at a vital point, the edge of the sword had firmly nailed her to the ground. King Tong's body trembled slightly. At this moment, she was covered in blood and dust, looking extremely dirty and embarrassed. But her eyes were still arrogant and angry, and her demeanor did not seem to diminish at all. Li Tianlan's figure appeared beside her. He was dressed in a military uniform and stood tall and straight. "How could you?" King Tong's voice was hoarse and weak. Obviously, she did not expect that Li Tianlan's injury had basically recovered. Not only her, but no one had expected that Li Tianlan's current combat capability had reached such a terrifying level. The timing of the sword strike just now was perfect. The sword energy was sharp, and the sword intent was superior. Obviously, Li Tianlan, who had recovered quickly after being seriously injured, did not lose his foundation as rumored. Instead, he went further. In this state, Li Tianlan was no weaker than those experts on the holy list who were ranked at the bottom. And he was not really in the invincible realm yet. Li Tianlan took a step forward with a calm expression and said in a calm tone, "I kindly invited you to the office of the president as a guest, but you refused, so I had to come here in person." Boom! A loud boom suddenly erupted in the distant sky. In the blink of an eye, the night sky within a 1,000-meter radius was completely illuminated. Light and shadows collided. As soon as King Tong was attacked, Paul almost did not hesitate to burst out all his power. The completely different light shone in the night sky and turned into colorful colors. It was gorgeous and dangerous, like a miracle. In the colorful night sky, blood sprinkled down along with the night rain. Paul seemed to have gone completely crazy. Shadow carnage seemed to have made his speed countless times faster. His figure was less than 2 meters away from Arsis. The two of them had almost given up all defense and were fighting desperately. The void above the sky was chaotic and turbulent. Colorful rays of light kept bursting out. As the two of them passed through the night sky, a dazzling rainbow suddenly appeared in the chaotic night sky. This was almost the peak battle in the Dark World. Even someone as strong as Mellad would find it difficult to participate without exposing his true strength. Li Tianlan squinted at the sky. It was not until this moment that he was completely sure of the true strength of the Patriarch of Rothschild. Arsis was obviously stronger than Paul. But there seemed to be something wrong with him now. His comprehensive strength had barely reached the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan couldn't see the effect of the Pope's coronation at all. After Paul left the domain of King Tong, his strength did decline, but the decline was extremely limited. Although Arsis had an advantage over Paul in his normal state, his advantage was extremely small. To put it in an exaggerated way, it was negligible. Arisis's only advantage was that his physical strength was still abundant, while Paul's physical strength was greatly consumed. However, in the current state, Arsis couldn't do anything to Paul for a while. On the contrary, Paul's body movement was extremely strange and the angle was tricky. When the two of them were almost the same in strength, Li Tianlan was surprised to find that Arsis had the possibility of failing miserably. He was not surprised that an expert at the peak of the invincible realm fought in close combat. The most helpless thing was that although Li Tianlan was very strong, it was obvious that he couldn't participate in a battle of this level at all. You will regret it, Li Tianlan. As long as I don't die sooner or later, you will regret everything you did tonight. King Tong's voice sounded in Li Tianlan's ears. It was hoarse and weak, and it sounded extremely resentful. Do you think I don't dare to kill you? Li Tianlan glanced at her. Why don't you try? King Tong sneered, and her voice was as cold as ice. If Li Tianlan wanted to kill her with that sword just now, he only needed to move a few centimeters closer, and she would definitely die. But Li Tianlan didn't do that. King Tong immediately figured out the key to the problem. Wang Tianzong did not appear on the battlefield tonight. But even the imprisoned Sword Emperor could still exert his will that could affect the general trend outside the battlefield. A very strange light flashed in King Tong's eyes. Her mouth seemed to move and she closed her eyes. Boom! There was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky above the heavy rain. Pale lightning flashed across the sky. Above the sky, the two battlefields had gone completely crazy. Arcis and Paul were still entangled. Mellad, however, had already turned around and joined another equally critical battlefield. Situ Tsongyue and Raphael were already covered in blood. Opposite him, Hastile and Lagos were equally disheveled. But with the addition of Mellad, the whole scene was slowly turning around. The two battlefields above the sky were getting closer and closer. The dazzling light crisscrossed the sky and the ground. The situation, which had been tilting toward Rothschild, was pulled back bit by bit. Li Tianlan looked calm, but his eyes were getting more and more serious. Even though his combat capability had improved after the date of death, he was still the weakest in the battlefield of the invincible realm tonight. The battlefield of Paul and Arcis was merging with the battlefield of Situ Tsongyue. In such a situation, it was hard for him to know what he was doing. And for him, the biggest threat at the moment was no longer the several invincible realm experts on the other side, but bang! An extremely dull explosion that seemed to be able to shake everyone's soul suddenly sounded without warning. Li Tianlan's heart sank in an instant. The battlefield on the ground, which was not as vast as the one in the sky but more tragic, suddenly rose with endless red light. This scene was so familiar that everyone felt like they had seen it before. Li Tianlan was even more familiar with it. This was the light of the devil troop. The red light spread wildly in the crowd with an incomparably distinct shock wave. The scarlet all over the sky swept everything in an instant. Wherever the light passed, the army of Wulan State, the elites of various forces, and even the Snowdance Corps were cleared in an instant. The whole street seemed to become empty in an instant. Li Tianlan's eyes instantly focused and he rushed directly in the direction of the explosion. After Qin Weibai's explanation, he had already understood what the so-called devil troop was. A group of walking corpses who used to be in the invincible realm was not the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing was that their bodies were transformed by the materials of murderous weapons. They could control the murderous weapons in an instant. The materials of the murderous weapons in their bodies could naturally store energy like the murderous weapons. Perhaps the only difference was that the devil troop could not be used indefinitely, but they could also explode. This group of walking corpses without much consciousness, to be precise, were small murderous weapons that could move. Li Tianlan no longer cared about the battlefield in the sky, because the advantage had gradually expanded and become obvious. As the battle came to an end, dealing with the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai was his most important task tonight. Boom! The moment Li Tianlan approached the devil troop, the two battlefields in the sky finally completely merged together. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.